Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On the 8th of June in the year 793, on a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in the north of England, a place the local people called Lindisfarne, the monks of a monastery that had stood there for nearly 150 years, rose as they had risen every morning of their working lives for the first prayers of the day in a church built of timber and stone to hold the bones of a beloved local saint named Cuthbert, a gentle hermit bishop who had died there a century before, and whose relics had made this old wind-scoured little island one of the most sacred places in all of Britain, a place of pilgrimage, of learning, of careful, patient work copying scripture by candlelight in a scriptorium whose monks were, at that very moment, in the middle of producing some of the most beautifully illuminated manuscripts that early medieval Europe would ever produce. The bishop who presided over that community, a man named Higbald, had spent his whole adult life inside the rhythm of that place. The tides that cut the island off from the mainland twice a day, the bells, the prayers, the long slow patience of a religious life lived at the edge of the known world. Nothing in the whole of Higbald's experience, nor in the experience of any bishop or abbot anywhere in Western Christendom that summer, had prepared him, or could have prepared him, for what came out of the sea that morning. They came in low, narrow, dragon-headed ships that the monks had never seen the like of before, vessels unlike any trading craft or fishing boat that ever put in along that coast. Ships that could run themselves straight up onto an open beach with no harbour and no warning at all. And out of them came men in numbers nobody had thought to count, armed, disciplined, and moving with a speed and a purpose that made it clear within minutes that this was not a shipwrecked crew looking for shelter, or a party of merchants blown off course. They fell upon the monastery itself, a community that had never in its whole existence needed a wall, a gate, or a single-armed guard, because who, in the whole of Christian Europe, would dream of raising a hand against the servants of God and the resting place of a saint? The raiders did not share that assumption, or if they knew it, they did not care. They killed some of the monks outright, cut down where they stood. They drove others into the sea to drown or drag them off in chains to be sold in the slave markets that ring the edges of the known world, for whatever a strong young man's body could fetch. They broke open the altars and stripped them of their silver and their gold, tore the jewelled covers from gospel books whose pages, to men who could not read a word of Latin, meant nothing at all beside the metal and the gemstones binding them, and scattered the sacred vessels of the church across the churchyard like so much plunder, which, to the men who took them, was exactly and only what they were. By the time the ships pulled back off the beach that same day, laden low in the water with their new cargo of silver and captives, the monastery of Lindisfarne, one of the holiest and most settled places in the whole of Britain, had been transformed, in the space of a single morning, into a smoking, blood-spattered ruin. Word of what had happened at Lindisfarne did not stay contained to Northumbria for long. It travelled, as horror always travels, faster and further than any ordinary news, reaching the ear of a Northumbrian-born scholar named Alcuin of York, who was, by that point in his life, living at the court of the Frankish King Charlemagne on the European continent, serving as one of the most respected churchmen and teachers in the whole of Latin Christendom. And Alcuin's letters, written in the weeks after the news reached him, survive to this day, and they are worth pausing on for a moment, because they capture, better than any other single document from that whole distant summer, the sheer unprepared shock that the raid produced in the minds of the people who heard about it. Never before, Alcuin wrote to Bishop Higbald, has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. It is worth sitting for just a moment with how strange and how new that sentence would have sounded to the ears it was written for, because the world Alcuin was describing, a world in which the sea itself, the wide, cold, empty northern sea that had always simply been there, doing nothing, going nowhere, had suddenly begun disgorging armed pagan strangers onto the shores of the most sacred places in Christendom, was a world nobody in Western Europe in the summer of 793 had ever previously had any reason to imagine. That is where this whole Long Night story begins, not because Lindisfarne was the very first Viking raid in absolute fact, since a small handful of earlier, less thoroughly documented raids on the English and Frankish coasts likely preceded it by a few years, but because Lindisfarne is where the terror entered the written record in a form clear and vivid enough that we can still feel the shock of it 13 centuries later, in the words of a man who lived through hearing about it. And terror, more than any other single word, is the thread this whole night's story is going to follow. Because for roughly 3 centuries after that June morning on a small tidal island in Northumbria, the peoples of Christian Europe, from the coasts of Ireland to the banks of the Seine, from the marshlands of Frisia to the walls of Constantinople itself, would live with a fear of the sea and of what the sea might bring that reshaped the way they built their towns, the way they governed their kingdoms, the way they prayed in their churches, and the way they told stories about the edges of their own known world. A prayer began to appear in these years, in the liturgies of churches across Britain and the European mainland, added to the ancient litanies alongside the pleas for deliverance from plague and famine, and the wrath of God, a prayer we will return to later in the story. 4 short words that tell you everything you need to know about how thoroughly this fear had settled into the daily religious life of ordinary people. From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord deliver us. How did it come to this? How did a scattering of farming and fishing communities clinging to the fjords and forests of a cold, thinly populated corner of northern Europe that the rest of the continent had scarcely bothered to notice for centuries become, within the span of a single generation, the single most feared and most talked about threat in the whole of Christian Europe? A threat vivid and immediate enough to be woven directly into the Church's own daily prayers. That is the question this whole long night is built to answer. Slowly, patiently, the way these questions deserve to be answered, without reaching too quickly for the easy, cartoonish shorthand of horned helmets and mindless bloodlust that popular memory has draped over these people ever since, because that shorthand, however satisfying it may feel, explains almost nothing. And it does something worse than explain nothing. It flattens a genuinely complicated, genuinely human story. A story of farmers and traders and explorers as much as raiders, of poets and lawgivers and shipbuilders of extraordinary skill, into a cardboard monster. And cardboard monsters, however useful they are for waking nightmares, are not what actually walked out of those ships and onto those beaches 13 centuries ago. The true answer, as it so often is in these long stories we tell in the dark, is not one thing, but many things arriving together. A revolution in shipbuilding that gave a scattering of Scandinavian communities a mobility across open water that no other people in Europe could match or even fully anticipate. A set of political and economic and demographic pressures building inside Scandinavian society itself. Pressures we will spend real time understanding before a single ship ever puts to sea in this story. A Christian Europe, whose wealth had concentrated itself, with a kind of unwitting generosity, into precisely the sort of undefended coastal and riverside targets that a fast, shallow-drafted raiding fleet could reach before anyone had time to organise a defence. And, running beneath all of it, a genuine and sophisticated culture of seamanship, navigation, and organised violence that the rest of Europe simply had no equivalent for, developed by a people who thought about the sea in a way that the landbound kingdoms to their south had never needed to think about it at all. The Vikings did not conquer Europe in the way that later conquerors like Napoleon Bonaparte would conquer it, in one continuous centrally directed campaign. There was no single king, no single unified nation of Vikings issuing orders from a single capital. What there was, instead, was something stranger, and in some ways more frightening, precisely because it was so decentralized. Independent bands of raiders, traders, settlers, and mercenaries sailing out from a scattering of chiefdoms and petty kingdoms across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, each pursuing its own fortune, its own feud, its own ambition, and together, across roughly 3 centuries, transforming the map, the economy, the bloodlines, and the political structures of an entire continent, from Ireland in the west, the Volga River deep inside what is now Russia in the east, from the Mediterranean coast of Spain in the south to the shores of a land they called Vinland, on the other side of an ocean that no other European people would cross again for another 500 years. Before we drift into the rest of this long story together, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because that is the only reason I would ever want you to. Please subscribe to this channel and help us in reaching 1,000 subscribers, a small milestone that would mean a great deal to this little corner of the internet. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. It is a small thing, but it helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the internet, and there is something quietly comforting about knowing that somewhere out there, in a different time zone under a different sky, a stranger is settling into their own bed tonight, listening to this same slow unspooling of history. So get comfortable now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your eyes soften, even if they stay open a while longer yet. Turn the light down if you can, and let yourself sink into the long tale of how the coldest, most thinly populated corner of Europe produced the sailors, the raiders, the traders, and the settlers who would for 300 years make the rest of the continent afraid of the sea itself, a people the rest of Europe barely knew. To understand how the terror of Lindisfarne became possible at all, we cannot begin with the ships, and we certainly cannot begin with the raids. We have to begin, as these long stories so often insist on beginning, with the world as it stood in Scandinavia in the centuries before anyone outside it had much reason to think about it, because the people who rowed those dragon-headed ships onto an English beach in 793 were not a people who appeared out of nowhere. They were the product of a very particular landscape, a very particular set of social arrangements, and a very particular set of technologies, all of which had been developing quietly for generations, entirely outside the notice of the Christian kingdoms to the south. It is worth naming at the outset exactly what we mean by Scandinavia in this period, because the tidy modern map of Norway, Sweden and Denmark as 3 settled nation-states did not exist in any form the people of the 8th century would have recognised. What existed instead was a long, ragged coastline of fjords and islands and forested inland valleys, home to dozens of small, competing chiefdoms and petty kingdoms ruled by local jarls and kings whose authority rarely extended more than a few days' travel from their own halls, bound together not by any centralised state but by a shared language, a shared set of gods, a shared set of poetic and legal traditions passed down orally from one generation to the next, and, above all, by the sea itself, which connected these scattered communities to one another far more efficiently than any road ever could, since a well-built ship, in a landscape this thoroughly cut apart by fjords and mountains and forest, could often cover in a single day's sailing what it would take a traveller on foot or on horseback the better part of a week to cross by land. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how completely that landscape shaped the people who grew up inside it, because nothing about the Viking Age makes sense without understanding the sheer physical difficulty of ordinary life in Scandinavia in this period. Norway in particular is a country where only a small fraction of the land, perhaps 3% by some later estimates, was ever suitable for growing crops at all. The rest given over to mountain, forest and fjord, so that farming communities clustered, of necessity, into narrow strips of arable soil squeezed between the water and the rock, communities that grew generation after generation, more crowded and more land-hungry than the soil around them could comfortably support. Sweden and Denmark offered somewhat gentler farmland, more open plains and better grazing, but even there the growing season was short, the winters long and dark, and the margin between a good harvest and a hard, hungry winter was thinner than anything a Frankish or English farmer, working richer and more forgiving soil further south, would have had to reckon with. Out of this landscape grew a society organised at its base around the individual farmstead, worked by an extended household that might include several generations of a single family, alongside servants, labourers, and, in a great many cases, enslaved people, a class of unfree labourers called thralls, whose labour underpinned Scandinavian farming, mining, and eventually Viking Age trade in ways that popular memory of this period tends to pass over far too quickly, and we will have reason to come back to the thralls of Scandinavian society more than once before this night is through, because a story that remembers only the free warriors and the raiding chieftains, and forgets the enslaved people whose labour and whose bodies move through this entire economy as a form of currency, is not telling the whole of this story honestly. Above the ordinary farming household sat a layered and intensely competitive aristocracy of local chieftains, jarls and petty kings, men, and very occasionally women, whose authority rested not on any inherited bureaucratic apparatus, since nothing resembling the tax-collecting, law-codifying, administrative machinery of a Roman or a Frankish state existed anywhere in pre-Viking Scandinavia, but on a far more personal and far more fragile foundation, a leader's own reputation for generosity, for luck, and above all for success in war and in raiding, a reputation that had to be actively maintained, gift by gift, feast by feast, victory by victory, because the warriors and free farmers who followed a given chieftain owed him loyalty not as a matter of fixed law, but as a matter of ongoing, renewable personal obligation, an arrangement historians of this period often describe using the Old Norse word for the mutual bond between a lord and his followers, a bond sealed again and again through the giving of gifts, most valuably gifts of silver, gold and captured plunder, the very kind of wealth that a successful raid overseas could supply in quantities that no amount of ordinary farming ever could. It is worth pausing on that arrangement, because it explains something that will matter enormously for the rest of this story. In a society where a chieftain's entire claim to authority rested on his ability to reward his followers generously, and where the most reliable, most spectacular source of sudden wealth available to an ambitious young leader was not farming, not herding, not even ordinary regional trade, but a successful raid against a wealthy and undefended target overseas, the entire social and political structure of Viking Age Scandinavia created, almost mechanically, a standing incentive for exactly the kind of seaborne violence that would soon terrify the rest of Europe. A young man of good family who wanted to build a following, win a wife and establish himself as a figure of consequence in a society that offered relatively few other paths to rapid advancement, had every practical reason to go raiding or trading, or very often both at once, since the line between the two activities, as we will see again and again in this story, was very much thinner in the Viking mind than it has ever been in the popular imagination that came after. It is worth naming too the religious world these people inhabited, because it shaped both how they understood violence and how the Christian societies they encountered would come to understand them. The pre-Christian religion of Scandinavia, the belief system modern people generally call Norse mythology, though the people who practiced it in the 8th and 9th centuries had no single word that corresponds neatly to our modern idea of a religion separate from the rest of daily life, centred on a pantheon of gods, chief among them Odin, a god of war, wisdom, poetry, and tellingly of death by violence rather than by age or sickness, and Thor, a god of thunder and physical strength who protected ordinary farmers and travellers, and around a cosmology that imagined the world as one of several linked realms connected by a great cosmic tree, all of it moving inexorably toward a final foretold battle at the end of the world called Ragnarok, in which even the gods themselves were destined to die. Central to this belief system was the idea of Valhalla, a hall in the realm of the gods where warriors who died bravely in battle would be gathered by Odin's own handmaidens, the Valkyries, to feast and fight in preparation for that final battle. An afterlife reserved, in the ideal at least, specifically for those who died with a weapon in hand rather than in a sickbed. And it is worth naming honestly that the degree to which ordinary Viking Age warriors actually organised their daily conduct around this specific promise of a warrior's paradise is a question modern historians debate more cautiously than older, more romantic accounts of Viking religion once did, since nearly everything we know about the details of this belief system comes from written sources recorded 2 or 3 centuries later, by Christian or newly Christianized writers in Iceland, working from oral traditions that had already been reshaped in ways we cannot always trace by the passage of time and by contact with the very Christian culture the old religion was eventually replaced by. What can be said with more confidence is that this was a warrior culture that placed an enormous and very public value on personal courage, on loyalty to one's kin and one's lord, and on the earning of reputation, of fame that would outlive the body, through deeds performed in full view of one's community, a set of values that, transplanted onto the deck of a longship bound for an undefended monastery on a foreign coast, produced exactly the kind of fearless, reputation-hungry raiding parties that the chroniclers of Christian Europe would soon be writing about in tones of undisguised horror. A ship that changed everything. If the social and religious world of pre-Viking Scandinavia explains why so many young men had reason to go raiding, it does not, on its own, explain how they could. And it is here that we have to spend real time with a single piece of technology, because without it, the entire history that follows in this story simply does not happen. And the terror of Lindisfarne, and everything after it, remains only a hypothetical rather than an actual thing that occurred. That technology was the longship, and it is worth naming plainly at the outset that the ship the Vikings sailed to war and to plunder was not a sudden invention that appeared out of nowhere in the last years of the 8th century, but the end product of many centuries of steady, incremental refinement by Scandinavian shipbuilders. Refinement we can trace archaeologically all the way back to boats like the Nidum ship built and buried in Denmark some 4 centuries before Lindisfarne, and forward, past the Viking Age itself, into ship burials like the one uncovered at Oseberg in Norway and the one at Gokstad nearby. Magnificent vessels interred with the bodies of powerful men and women and preserved by the particular chemistry of Scandinavian clay and bog, well enough that modern archaeologists have been able to study, and in several remarkable cases actually rebuild and sail, ships essentially identical to the ones that terrified the coasts of Britain and France. The genius of the Viking longship lay in a handful of design choices that, taken together, produced a vessel with capabilities no other seafaring culture in contemporary Europe could match. It was built using a technique called clinker construction, in which overlapping planks of oak were riveted together edge over edge, a method that produced a hull both remarkably light and remarkably flexible, able to twist and flex with the motion of open water in a way that a more rigidly built vessel could not, which meant the ship could absorb the punishment of rough seas without breaking apart while remaining light enough to be rowed for long stretches by a relatively modest crew, and light enough, crucially, to be hauled up onto an open beach or dragged bodily overland between 2 rivers when the water route ran out, a portability that would matter enormously once these ships began pushing deep into the river systems of France, and, later still, of Russia. It was shallow in draught, drawing sometimes no more than 3 or 4 feet of water even when fully loaded with men and cargo, which meant it could sail not only across open ocean, but directly up rivers that ocean-going vessels of any other design would have run aground in within the first few miles, straight into the heart of inland towns and monasteries that their inhabitants had always assumed were safe from any seaborne threat by simple virtue of being nowhere near the open sea. And it combined a single square sail for speed and endurance on longer open water passages with a full complement of oars for manoeuvrability in confined coastal waters, in the mouths of rivers, and for the final crucial burst of speed needed to run a raiding party up onto a beach before its intended victims had any real chance to organise a defence. A hybrid of wind power and human muscle that gave Viking crews a flexibility no purely sail-driven or purely oar-driven vessel of the period could equal. It is worth naming too the symmetrical double-ended hull, curved up into a high prow and an equally high stern, a design that let a longship reverse direction almost instantly, backing off a beach under oar power without the time-consuming business of turning the whole vessel around, an advantage that meant the difference, more than once in the raids we're about to follow, between a raiding party that escaped with its plunder and a raiding party trapped against a shoreline by a defending force that had finally, belatedly arrived. The most famous ships, the ones that carried raiding parties across open ocean and up the great rivers of the European mainland, were what later ages would come to call longships proper, narrow, fast, built for speed and war rather than cargo capacity, crewed by anywhere from a few dozen to, in the largest examples built at the very height of the Viking Age, well over 100 men rowing in close, disciplined unison. But it is worth naming honestly too that a great deal of the actual traffic that moved along Viking Age sea routes travelled instead in a broader, deeper-hulled cousin of the longship called the Nar, a sturdy cargo vessel built to carry livestock, timber, trade goods, and eventually entire families and their possessions across open water to new settlements in places like Iceland and eventually Greenland, a reminder, worth holding on to as this story unfolds, that the same shipbuilding tradition that produced the raiders of Lindisfarne also produced the traders, the colonists and the explorers who make up such a large and so frequently overlooked a part of what we mean when we say the word Viking. And it is worth naming finally the navigational skill that these ships demanded, and that Scandinavian sailors had developed to a degree of sophistication the rest of Europe simply had not, because a fast, flexible ship is only as useful as the crew's ability to find their way across open water without the benefit of a compass, an instrument that would not reach northern Europe for centuries yet. Viking sailors navigated by the sun and the stars where they were visible, by the direction and pattern of ocean swells where they were not, by the flight paths of seabirds known to nest on specific coastlines, by the colour and temperature, and even the taste of the water itself, and by an accumulated, orally transmitted body of practical knowledge passed from experienced sailors to novices across generations about how long a given open water crossing ought to take and what landmarks to expect along the way, knowledge sophisticated enough that Scandinavian sailors would, within a century of Lindisfarne, use it to find and settle Iceland, a genuinely difficult multi-day crossing of open North Atlantic water with no land in sight for most of the voyage, and not long after that Greenland, and not long after that a stretch of coastline on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean that no other European people would so much as glimpse again for another 500 years. It is worth letting that achievement sit next to the raids for a moment, because both grew out of the exact same hard-won mastery of the sea, and a story that remembers only the burning monasteries and forgets the astonishing feat of open ocean navigation that made everything else in this story possible, is telling only half of what these people actually accomplished. Why the raids began when they did. Even with a ship this capable sitting ready in Scandinavian harbours, the question remains why the raids began specifically in the final years of the 8th century, rather than 50 years earlier or 50 years later. And it is worth naming, honestly, that historians have never settled on a single tidy answer to that question, and that any account which offers you one without qualification is simplifying a genuinely contested piece of history for the sake of a cleaner story. What we can say with real confidence is that several separate pressures appear to have been building inside Scandinavian society across the 8th century. Pressures that, arriving together in these particular decades, made the sudden eruption of long-distance raiding look, in retrospect, considerably less like an unexplainable bolt from the blue, and considerably more like the moment several slow-building forces finally crossed a threshold at once. There is the pressure of population and land, a pressure we have already touched on, a Scandinavian population that appears, on the evidence of expanding farm settlements and forest clearance uncovered by archaeologists, to have been growing steadily across the 7th and 8th centuries, pressing harder against a finite and often marginal supply of good farmland, particularly along the fjord coast of Norway, where the practice of dividing inherited land among sons, generation after generation, steadily shrank the average farm down toward a size that could no longer comfortably support a family, creating across the generations a growing surplus of younger sons with strong backs, real fighting skill, and increasingly limited prospects for inheriting land of their own at home. Exactly the kind of restless, ambitious, land-hungry young men who make the ideal recruits for an overseas raiding party or, in time, an overseas settlement. There is the pressure, too, of political consolidation, a slower and more uneven process across this period. Older, tidier accounts of Viking history sometimes suggest, but a real one nonetheless, as ambitious regional chieftains across Norway and Denmark worked, generation after generation, to expand their own authority at the expense of their neighbours, a process of consolidation that would culminate by the later 9th century in the emergence of the first kings powerful enough to claim authority over something resembling the whole of Norway, most famously a king remembered in later Icelandic saga tradition as Harald Fairhair, whose unification of Norwegian petty kingdoms, whatever its precise historical details, which the sagas themselves, written centuries later, likely exaggerate and simplify, appears to have pushed a real number of defeated rivals, displaced chieftains and their followers out of Norway entirely, into exactly the kind of overseas raiding and settlement that would soon populate places like Iceland, with Norwegian refugees from a homeland growing too centralised, too contested, and too dangerous for a losing faction to safely remain in. There is the pressure of trade as well, an underappreciated engine of this whole story that we will return to again and again. Scandinavian merchants and chieftains had, across the 8th century, been drawn increasingly into long-distance trading networks that reached south into Frankish territory and east along the rivers of what is now Russia toward the wealthy Islamic caliphates of the Middle East. Trade that brought Arab silver coins, called dirhams, flowing north into Scandinavia in enormous quantities, coins that archaeologists have unearthed by the tens of thousands in Scandinavian hoards, and that trade had already given ambitious Scandinavian leaders both a taste for the kind of portable wealth that silver represented, and, just as importantly, an intimate, practical, ship-borne familiarity with the coastlines, river mouths and market towns of the lands to their south and east. An intimacy that made the leap from trading partner to raider a far smaller and far more natural one than it might otherwise have been, since the same ship, the same crew, and very often the same individual leader could serve as trader in one season and raider in the next, depending on nothing more than the balance of opportunity and risk that presented itself at a given port. And there is, finally, the pressure of opportunity itself, sitting on the other side of the North Sea, because a story that explains the Viking raids purely by looking north at Scandinavian society, without also looking south at the society the raiders were about to descend upon, tells only half the story. The Christian kingdoms of Britain and the European mainland had spent the 2 centuries before Lindisfarne building up precisely the kind of concentrated, portable, undefended wealth that a fast raiding fleet could not resist, in the form of monasteries, an institution that had spread across Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms in extraordinary numbers since the early days of Christian conversion. Monasteries that had, by the late 8th century, accumulated enormous stores of silver and gold in the form of altar vessels, jewelled book covers and reliquaries built to house the bones of saints, wealth given to the church, gift by pious gift, across generations by kings and nobles seeking to secure their own souls, and stored almost without exception in buildings that had never once needed a defensive wall. Because who, before 793, would have imagined that anyone, pagan or Christian, would dare to violate the sanctuary of God's own house? Lindisfarne was not chosen at random. It sat on an island just off a coastline that Scandinavian traders had almost certainly already been sailing past for years on entirely peaceful business. A monastery whose wealth and whose complete lack of any physical defence would have been common knowledge among any trader or sailor who had ever put in anywhere along that stretch of coast. And it is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it tells us something important about the raid that opened this story. It was very likely not the blind, opportunistic strike of men who stumbled onto an unexpected target, but a calculated act by people who understood exactly what they were attacking and exactly how little resistance they would meet when they did. There is a way of thinking about the 3 centuries this story is about to walk you through that I want to set down early, because we will come back to it more than once before the night is over, and it is this. Think of the Viking presence in Christian Europe as a tide. A tide does not announce itself with a single decisive event. It arrives in advancing waves, each one reaching a little further up the shore than the last, testing the ground, retreating, and returning again, larger, better prepared, more confident, until entire stretches of coastline that once stood dry and settled are, for a season, or for a generation, or, in some places, for good, simply underwater, absorbed into the sea's own territory. And then, just as inevitably, just as patiently, a tide turns, and the water it once held begins, wave by wave, to withdraw again, leaving behind a changed shoreline that never quite returns to what it was before the water came. Keep that image somewhere in the back of your mind as this story unfolds, because nearly everything that happens across the next 300 years, the raids, the settlements, the conquests, the conversions, and finally the ebbing away of Scandinavian power from the lands it had once flooded, follows the same essential rhythm, arriving not as a single conquest, but as tide after tide after tide. The first waves of that tide in the years immediately following Lindisfarne struck with a randomness and an unpredictability that made them, if anything, more terrifying than a declared war would have been, because a declared war has fronts and armies and a predictable geography of danger. A raiding party that can appear from open water at any point along an undefended coastline, strike within hours, and vanish again before any organised force can respond offers no such comfort. In the years after 793, raiders struck the Scottish island monastery of Iona, sacred to the memory of St Columba and one of the most important centres of learning and manuscript production in the entire Irish and British Church, not once but repeatedly across the following decades, forcing its monks, eventually, to abandon the island altogether and relocate the community, along with its most precious relics and books, safely inland, a forced migration that carried Iona's monks, and, according to a long and not fully certain but widely credited tradition among art historians, a magnificently illuminated gospel book already underway or freshly completed on the island, to a new and better fortified daughter monastery inland at Kells in Ireland, where that same gospel manuscript, whether begun at Iona and finished at Kells or begun afresh there entirely, would eventually be completed, bound and preserved down to the present day as the Book of Kells, one of the single most celebrated masterpieces of early medieval art anywhere in Europe, its pages covered in an almost hallucinogenic density of interlaced ornament, animal figures, and human faces worked in pigments imported from as far away as Afghanistan, a genuinely extraordinary object that a great many of the millions of visitors who file past it each year in Dublin today have no idea owes its very survival, however indirectly, to the same Viking raids this story has spent so much of tonight describing, since it was precisely the fear of exactly the kind of raid Iona kept suffering that drove the manuscript and the community that made it to the safer inland ground where it could finally be finished and centuries later found. They struck the coasts of Ireland, where by the 830s raiding had become frequent and organised enough that Irish annalists, the monks who kept the yearly chronicles that are one of our best surviving sources for this whole period, began recording Viking attacks on Irish monasteries with a grim regularity that tells its own story about how quickly this new threat had become simply a fact of Irish coastal life, and they struck with increasing frequency and increasing ambition the coasts and the river mouths of the Frankish kingdom on the European mainland, the single wealthiest and most powerful Christian state in the whole of Western Europe, ruled at the very moment Lindisfarne burned by the towering figure of Charlemagne himself, a king who had already spent decades subduing the pagan Saxons on his own eastern frontier through a campaign of forced conversion and outright massacre, brutal enough that Charlemagne's own chroniclers record it without much apparent discomfort, and who, according to at least one much-told and possibly embellished later story, is said to have wept upon seeing a fleet of Northmen's ships sighted off the southern coast of Frankish Gaul late in his reign, not from fear for himself, since he knew the raiders would never dare attack while he himself commanded the coast, but from a grim foreknowledge of what such ships would do to his own kingdom and his own grandchildren once the old emperor was no longer alive to hold the frontier. It is worth naming, too, that Charlemagne himself, in the very last years of his reign, had not been blind to the danger his own chroniclers record him weeping over. The Royal Frankish Annals, the official year-by-year record kept at his own court, note that the ageing emperor personally toured the North Sea and Channel coastline late in his life, inspecting the defences of ports he judged vulnerable, and ordered the construction of a coastal fleet and a system of watch stations intended specifically to give early warning of exactly the kind of seaborne raid that would, within a generation, become this story's central subject. A genuinely far-sighted response that, had it been maintained and expanded by his successors with anything like the same seriousness, might have blunted a great deal of what followed. It was not maintained. Within a few years of Charlemagne's death, as his son Louis the Pious grew absorbed in the ordinary business of holding together an empire, already showing the strain of the succession disputes that would eventually tear it into three pieces at Verdun, the coastal fleet and its watch stations were allowed to decay through simple neglect, ships left unrepaired, garrisons left unpaid and unreplaced, a defensive system built by one far-sighted ruler quietly dismantled, not through any single deliberate decision to abandon it, but through the same slow, unglamorous, administrative drift that undoes so many well-intentioned institutions once the particular person who cared enough to maintain them is no longer there to insist on it. And it is worth sitting with that quiet failure for a moment, because it is a considerably less dramatic story than a burning monastery, and considerably more common in the long run as a genuine cause of historical catastrophe. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but an early warning system nobody quite got around to keeping in good repair, watched over by a watchman whose posts were simply, gradually, never refilled. It is worth naming plainly what happened next because it explains, more than any single factor we have discussed so far, why the raids of the 9th century grew so rapidly from isolated coastal strikes into something approaching a systematic dismantling of Frankish coastal power. Charlemagne died in the year 814, and the vast, only loosely unified empire he had spent his life assembling, an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe and from the North Sea nearly to Rome, passed to his son Louis the Pious, and then, upon Louis's own death in 840, fractured in a bitter and prolonged civil war among Louis's surviving sons into competing kingdoms that would, by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, formally divide what had been Charlemagne's single empire into three separate, mutually suspicious, and periodically warring Frankish realms. An internal fracturing of Christian Europe's single most powerful state at the precise moment its coasts and river valleys most needed a unified defence against a rapidly escalating seaborne threat. It is worth sitting with the timing of that coincidence, because it is not, in any deep sense, a coincidence at all, so much as it is the same pattern this whole story keeps returning to. Viking success, again and again across these 3 centuries, depended less on any single overwhelming military advantage the raiders possessed than on the political disunity and internal distraction of the societies they preyed upon. Societies whose own rulers were very often too busy fighting one another, or too suspicious of a rival Frankish king's ambitions, to mount the kind of sustained, coordinated coastal defence that might otherwise have shut this whole threat down within a decade of its beginning. Into that fractured and distracted kingdom sailed raiding fleets that grew across the 830s and 840s, from small opportunistic bands into large organised forces capable of striking deep inland along the great navigable rivers of the Frankish realm, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, the Rhine, rivers that, as we've already seen, a shallow-drafted longship could ascend for scores or even hundreds of miles, striking towns and monasteries that had never imagined themselves within reach of a seaborne enemy at all. The great trading port of Dorestad on the Rhine in Frisia, one of the busiest and wealthiest commercial towns in the whole of northern Europe, was raided so many times across the 830s and 840s, by some counts nearly every year for a decade and more, that its trade never fully recovered, and the town itself, once among the most important markets in the Frankish world, faded, by the century's end, into Core's comparative obscurity, a slow economic strangulation delivered not by a single dramatic conquest, but by the accumulated, repeated damage of raid after raid after raid, each one draining away a little more of the town's wealth, its population, and its will to rebuild. It is worth naming too that the Frankish response to Dorestad's suffering eventually included an early version of the very same bargain that this story will later watch play out at much larger scale with Rollo and Normandy, because a Danish chieftain named Rorik, whose own career of raiding and dynastic infighting back in Denmark had left him, for long stretches, a king without a kingdom, was granted by Emperor Louis the Pious's own son and eventual successor, formal authority over Dorestad and the surrounding Frisian coastland as a Frankish vassal, in exchange for Rorik's promise to defend the very same stretch of coast against other Viking raiders who might otherwise be tempted to strike it. An arrangement that held, with real interruptions and real relapses into fresh raiding on Rorik's own part whenever the political wind shifted in his favour, for the better part of 4 decades, making Rorik of Dorestad, more than half a century before Rollo ever reached the Seine, the very first clear example this story has to offer of the pattern that would eventually give France its Duchy of Normandy. A Frankish ruler discovering that the cheapest and most durable way to stop one Viking fleet from raiding a stretch of coastline was very often to hand that same coastline over to a different Viking leader, and pay him, in land and title, to guard it instead. And in the year 845, a Viking fleet, said in later, not entirely reliable Frankish and Norse tradition to have been led by a chieftain named Ragnar, a figure we will need to spend real time untangling from legend a little later in this story, sailed up the Seine and struck at the very heart of Frankish royal power itself, the city of Paris, at that point in its history a considerably smaller and less fortified place than the great capital it would later become, and rather than meet the raiders in open battle with a force he did not trust to win, the Frankish king Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, and ruler of the western portion of the divided empire, made a decision that would echo across the rest of this story, with consequences far beyond that single year. He paid the raiders to leave, a sum reported by Frankish chroniclers at some £7,000 of silver and gold, an enormous fortune extracted in practice through emergency taxation of Charles's own already suffering subjects, handed over to a raiding fleet in exchange for its withdrawal from a city Charles judged himself unable to defend by force. It is worth dwelling on that payment because it introduces a practice that would become, across the following 2 centuries, one of the single most consequential and most bitterly resented features of the entire Viking Age, a practice the English would eventually give its own lasting name. Danegeld, literally Dane gold, tribute paid by a Christian kingdom to a Viking fleet purely to buy a temporary peace. On the narrow, immediate calculation of a single threatened city, paying the ransom to Paris in 845 was, in a certain cold sense, entirely rational. It saved the city from sack, spared an unknown number of lives, and cost Charles a fortune he could, however painfully, still raise through his kingdom's taxation. But it is worth naming too, honestly, what that same rational calculation taught every ambitious raiding chieftain who heard about it in the years that followed, which was that a large, well-organised fleet, arriving at the right moment against a target too rich and too poorly defended to fight back, need not even risk the dangers of an actual siege or an actual battle in order to come home enormously wealthy, since the mere credible threat of destruction aimed at a city with more silver than stomach for a fight could extract a fortune all on its own. Danegeld did not end the raids on Frankish territory. If anything, the practice, repeated again and again across the following decades by one Frankish ruler after another, each one facing his own immediate crisis and reaching for the same short-term solution his predecessors had reached for, seems to have positively encouraged them, advertising across the whole of the Viking world that Frankish kings could reliably be relied upon to pay rather than fight, an incentive structure that turned the entire undefended river network of the Frankish kingdom into something very close to an open, recurring invitation. The raids on the Frankish mainland continued, wave after wave, across the following decades, growing bolder still in the 850s and 860s, when Viking fleets began for the first time overwintering directly inside Frankish territory rather than sailing home each autumn, building fortified camps on defensible river islands from which they could launch raids the following spring without ever having lost the geographic advantage they had spent the previous season winning. A tactical shift that turned what had been seasonal, hit-and-run violence into something closer to a semi-permanent occupation of contested territory. It is worth naming too that not every kingdom this tide reached proved as slow to organise an effective defence as Francia so often did, and Muslim Spain offers one of this story's clearest counter-examples. In the year 84, a Viking fleet sailed south along the Iberian coast and struck the great city of Seville, then one of the wealthiest cities of the Emirate of Cordoba, sacking part of it before the emir, Abd al-Rahman II, assembled a large and well-organised force, met the raiders in the field, and inflicted on them a defeat severe enough by the account of contemporary Arab chroniclers to kill or capture a large portion of the raiding fleet's own crews, and to discourage any further large-scale Viking assault on Andalusian territory for a full generation afterward, a genuinely rare instance this early in the story, of a wealthy target meeting a raiding fleet with organised resistance rather than either successful surprise or a desperate payment of tribute, and a useful reminder that the Viking tide met real, effective resistance considerably more often than the string of Frankish and early English disasters this story has mostly followed so far might suggest wherever the society on the receiving end happened to possess, as Muslim Spain did, and as Francia so often did not in these particular decades. A genuinely unified and genuinely well-organised central authority ready to respond. In 859 and 860, one of the most audacious raiding expeditions of the whole century, led, according to later tradition, by two chieftains named Björn Ironside and Hastein, names that Norse legend would later attach with more enthusiasm than certainty to the sons of the same legendary Ragnar associated with the 845 raid on Paris, sailed clean out of the Bay of Biscay and into the Mediterranean Sea itself, a body of water no Scandinavian fleet had ever before penetrated, raiding along the coasts of Spain, then held partly by Muslim Andalusian rulers who gave the raiders considerably rougher treatment than the Franks had, and along the coast of Italy, where the fleet is said, in a story whose precise details later chroniclers embellished into something closer to folk tale, to have tricked its way into a fortified Italian town by pretending its own chieftain had died and asking for Christian burial rites inside the town's walls, only to rise from the coffin, sword in hand, once safely inside the gates. Whatever the precise truth buried beneath that particular legend, the raid itself is solidly enough attested to tell us something important. By the middle of the 9th century, barely 2 generations after Lindisfarne, Viking fleets had extended their reach from the cold coasts of northern Britain all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean, a span of operations that no other seaborne power in contemporary Europe could remotely match. Paris would not always prove so easy a target, however, and it is worth pausing on a second and considerably better documented siege of that same city, one that unfolded a full 4 decades after the ransom of 845, and that shows us, in miniature, exactly how the balance of this whole long war could shift once a defender finally learned the lessons a raiding fleet had spent 2 generations teaching it. In November of the year 885, a Viking fleet reported by Frankish chroniclers with the kind of round, possibly inflated numbers this story has already learned to treat with caution, that some 700 ships and tens of thousands of men sailed once more up the Seine, only to find that the city they intended to pass, on their way to raid the richer country further upstream, was no longer the poorly fortified town Ragnar's raiders had bypassed with ease in 845. In the intervening decades, the Counts of Paris had rebuilt and strengthened the city's fortifications, including 2 newly reinforced bridges, each anchored by a fortified tower, that together blocked the river itself and made it impossible for the raiding fleet to simply row past the city as earlier fleets had always done. The Viking commanders demanded passage. The city's defenders, led by a count named Odo, later remembered as one of the great heroes of this whole chapter of Frankish history, refused, and what followed was not a swift raid but a genuine siege, stretching across more than a year, in which Odo's garrison, desperately outnumbered, held the city's walls and its fortified bridges through repeated assaults, through a winter of hunger and disease, and through a famous episode in which Odo himself is said to have slipped out through the besieging lines to ride for help and returned, cutting his way back in through the Viking blockade to the cheers of his own starving defenders, a piece of personal heroism that Frankish chroniclers understandably delighted to have a genuine victory to record after so many decades of ransom and retreat, recorded with evident relish. The siege ended, in the end, not in the clean, decisive Frankish triumph that later legend sometimes prefers to remember, but in a characteristically messy compromise. The reigning emperor, Charles the Fat, arriving at last with a relief force, chose to pay the besieging Vikings a fresh tribute to withdraw rather than force a final battle, permitting them, in a decision that scandalised Odo and cost Charles a great deal of his own remaining prestige, to sail on unmolested to raid Burgundy instead. A resolution that satisfied almost nobody, but that nonetheless marked a genuine turning point, because Paris itself, thanks to Odo's fortifications and Odo's refusal to simply open the gates, had held for the first time in this whole story against a fleet that would, in an earlier decade, have simply rowed past its undefended walls and burned it to the ground within the week. It is worth naming this siege as the Frankish mirror of the very same lesson Alfred was learning at almost exactly the same moment on the other side of the Channel, that a fortified town properly garrisoned and properly led could turn the raiders' single greatest advantage, speed against an unprepared target, into no advantage at all. But it was in England, more than anywhere else in this story, that the tide would rise highest and stay longest. And it is worth turning our attention there now, because the campaign that unfolded across England in the second half of the 9th century represents, by any honest measure, the single most consequential and most thoroughly documented chapter in the entire history of Viking warfare in Western Europe, a campaign whose consequences would still be shaping the English language, English law, and the political map of Britain itself 1,000 years later. England in the year 865 was not yet a single unified kingdom at all, but a patchwork of several separate and often rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, chief among them Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east and Wessex in the south and west, kingdoms that had spent much of the preceding century fighting one another for regional dominance, rather than presenting anything resembling a unified front against an outside threat. A political fragmentation that, exactly as we saw across the Channel in Francia, would prove to be one of the single greatest gifts the Viking raiders were ever handed. In that year, a force considerably larger and considerably more ambitious than any single raiding fleet that had come before it landed on the eastern coast of England. An army that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, writing in the annal we now call the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our single most important surviving sources for this entire period, and a document we will need to return to later, when we talk honestly about the biases built into our sources, called simply the Great Heathen Army, a force whose recorded numbers historians still argue over, since medieval chroniclers were rarely precise or unbiased counters of an enemy's strength, but whose actual size, on the more careful modern estimates, likely ran into the low thousands rather than the tens of thousands that older romantic telling sometimes claimed. Still an extraordinary concentration of fighting men by the standards of any single raiding fleet that had come before it in this story. And, crucially, an army that had come not merely to raid and withdraw with the tide, but for the first time in this whole story to conquer and to stay. Later Norse tradition, recorded centuries afterward in Icelandic sagas, whose reliability is strict history. We will need to weigh carefully before this night is over. Names the leaders of this army as the sons of the same legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. We have already met twice in this story. Chief among them a commander remembered as Ivar the Boneless, whose strange epithet has been explained by later storytellers in ways ranging from a genuine physical disability, perhaps a form of brittle bone disease that left him unable to walk and requiring him to be carried into battle on a shield, to a coarser and less literal folk explanation about impotence or extraordinary flexibility and uncertainty worth naming honestly rather than resolving with false confidence, since no contemporary source actually describes the man clearly enough for us to know which, if any, of these later explanations comes close to the truth. What the more reliable contemporary chronicles do tell us, with considerably more confidence than they tell us about any individual leader's personal legend, is what this army actually did, systematically and with a speed that stunned the kingdoms it swept through. It took Northumbria first, capturing the city of York in 806, amid a Northumbrian civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, a deposed king named Osbert, and a rival named Ella, who had pushed him from the throne only shortly before the great army's arrival. A kingdom so consumed by its own internal quarrel that its two rival kings, according to the near contemporary account of these events, only managed to set their quarrel aside and unite their forces against the invaders after York itself had already fallen into Viking hands, mounting a desperate counter-attack on the captured city that ended in catastrophe. both rival claimants killed in the fighting, a single tidy illustration of exactly the kind of exploited internal division that would leave the kingdom too divided to mount an effective defence until it was already too late to matter. And it is this same Ella, whatever the precise truth buried beneath the layers of later legend, whom Norse saga tradition would go on to remember as the king who cast the legendary Ragnar into a pit of snakes, and whose own death at Northumbria's fall the sons of the same legendary Ragnar are consistently said, across multiple independent strands of later tradition, to have sought out and avenged with particular and deliberate ferocity a pattern of exploited internal division we have now seen repeated so many times in this story that it has stopped being a coincidence and become plainly the single most reliable predictor of where and when Viking conquest actually succeeded. It turned next on East Anglia, where in the year 869, its king, a man remembered by later English tradition as Edmund, was captured and killed, and where the manner of his death, as later Christian hagiography came to tell it, involved the king being tied to a tree and shot full of arrows, then beheaded, a martyrdom that transformed the defeated King Edmund, within a generation, into Saint Edmund, one of medieval England's most venerated royal martyrs. His cult centred on the abbey town that still bears his name, Bury St Edmunds, a reminder, worth sitting with for a moment, of how directly the trauma of Viking conquest fed into the religious imagination of the English Church in the centuries that followed, turning a defeated king into a sanctified symbol of Christian suffering at pagan hands. It moved on to Mercia, forcing that kingdom's king into submission, and eventually within a few years into exile. And by the mid-870s, of the four great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had stood in 865, only one remained unconquered. Wessex, in the south and west of England, ruled from the year 871 onward by a young king named Alfred. It is worth naming plainly just how close England came in these years to disappearing entirely as a Christian English-ruled land, because the near-miss quality of what followed tends to get smoothed over by the triumphant later reputation of the king who eventually prevailed. Alfred came to the Wessex throne already at war, in the middle of a year, 871, that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers would later remember as a year of 9 pitched battles against the Viking army in a single kingdom alone. A year Alfred did not begin as king at all, but as a younger brother fighting alongside his older brother, King Ethelred of Wessex. And it is worth pausing on the very first of those 9 battles, fought that January at a place called Ashdown, because the account of it that survives, recorded by Alfred's own biographer, a Welsh monk named Asa writing some years later at Alfred's own court, offers one of the most vivid single anecdotes this whole story has to offer about the young man who would eventually save his kingdom. According to Asa, King Ethelred, on the morning of the battle, refused to break off his own prayers in his tent, even as the Viking army advanced and drew up its battle lines on the ridge above, insisting that God's favour mattered more than any earthly haste, while his younger brother Alfred, watching the enemy formation close the distance with every passing minute, judged that a delay any longer would mean fighting at a serious tactical disadvantage, and in a decision Asa frames as the first clear sign of the leadership that would define the rest of Alfred's life, ordered the West Saxons' shield wall to advance without waiting any longer for his brother to finish. Charging uphill into the Viking line, Asa tells us, like a wild boar, and breaking it, in a hard-fought victory that killed a Viking king and several of his earls, and that gave the young prince his very first taste of a battlefield he had, by his own later account, feared he might not survive. It was a single victory in a war that would, in the years immediately following, go very badly for Wessex regardless, since a battlefield triumph at Ashdown could not, on its own, prevent the string of later reverses that would eventually drive the newly crowned King Alfred into hiding. But it is worth holding on to the image of that impatient young prince all the same, because the same restless refusal to simply wait and pray while an enemy closed the distance is, in its own quieter way, exactly the same quality that would carry Alfred out of the Somerset marshes 7 years later and back onto a battlefield of his own choosing. In January of the year 1878, a Viking force under a chieftain named Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack, a season when medieval armies conventionally expected campaigning to pause, striking so suddenly and so effectively at Alfred's own royal court that the King of Wessex was forced to flee into hiding, reduced, for a period of weeks that later English legend would embroider with the famous, probably apocryphal story of Alfred absent-mindedly burning a peasant woman's cakes while lost in thought over his kingdom's desperate situation, to a small band of followers sheltering in the marshes of Somerset at a place called Athelney, the closest England would come in this entire story to losing its last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom outright. But Alfred did not stay hidden. Emerging from the Somerset marshes that spring with a gathered force of loyal followers from across the surrounding shires, he met Guthrum's army in battle at a place called Eddington in May of 878 and won a victory decisive enough to force Guthrum himself to sue for peace, a peace whose terms, remarkably by the standards of everything we have seen in this story so far, went well beyond a simple payment of tribute. Guthrum agreed to be baptised as a Christian, taking the baptismal name Athelstan with Alfred himself, standing as his royal godfather, a genuinely striking image to sit with for a moment, an Anglo-Saxon king raising a defeated Viking warlord from the baptismal font as a spiritual son, and the two men agreed, in a treaty that followed, to a formal division of England along a rough boundary line, with Alfred and his heirs retaining Wessex and the southwest, and Guthrum and the Vikings who followed him settling permanently in the eastern and northern portions of the kingdom, a territory that would come to be known from this point forward as the Danelaw, a region governed under Scandinavian rather than Anglo-Saxon law and custom, its place names, its legal vocabulary, and eventually its very bloodlines transformed by a wave of Scandinavian settlement that followed the original conquering army, farmers and craftsmen and their families arriving in the decades after 878 to build permanent lives on English soil rather than raiding it and sailing home. At the political heart of this new Scandinavian England sat a cluster of 5 fortified towns: Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester and Stamford, each governed by its own Danish garrison and its own local assembly. Rather than by any single overarching Danelaw government, a loose confederation later English sources came to call simply the 5 boroughs, a term that survives to this day in the modern English word borough itself. These 5 towns functioned, across the decades that followed Guthrum's settlement, less as an occupied colony administered from some distant centre than as a genuinely autonomous network of Anglo-Scandinavian city-states, prosperous, self-governing and bound to one another by trade and mutual defence considerably more than by any formal shared crown, which is a large part of why the reconquest this story has already described, carried out piece by Alfred's own children and grandchildren, had to proceed the way it did, town by fortified town, rather than through any single decisive campaign against a unified Danelaw army, since there was, in the end, no single Danelaw army left standing by the time of the reconquest at all, only a scattering of proud, independently governed Anglo-Scandinavian towns, each one needing to be persuaded, garrisoned, or fought into submission on its own separate terms. It is worth pausing here, because the Danelaw is one of the single clearest pieces of evidence in this entire story for something we will need to keep returning to across the rest of this night, that the Viking presence in the lands they touched was very rarely only a story of violence, and very often, once the initial conquest had run its course, a story of settlement, of intermarriage, of law, and of a slow, uneven blending of 2 cultures into something new, Wide stretches of eastern and northern England still carry in their place names the unmistakable fingerprint of that Scandinavian settlement to this day, towns and villages ending in the Old Norse suffix meaning farmstead or settlement, names like Whitby and Grimsby and Derby, and Thorpe, meaning a secondary or outlying settlement, and a great many ordinary English words in daily use across the whole English-speaking world today. Words like sky, window, knife, egg, husband, law, and even the pronouns they, them, and their, entered the English language directly from the Old Norse, spoken by these Danelaw settlers, a linguistic inheritance so deep and so thoroughly absorbed into the language that most English speakers today use it every single day, without the faintest awareness that they are, in that moment, still speaking a little bit of Viking. Alfred, for his part, spent the years of relative peace that followed his victory at Edington not resting on that victory but building, with the same restless, methodical energy this whole story has already shown us in other conquerors, under very different circumstances, the institutional foundations that would eventually allow Wessex, and the Kingdom of England that grew out of it, to withstand the Viking pressure permanently rather than merely surviving one crisis at a time. He established a network of fortified towns across Wessex called burhs, positioned so that no resident of the kingdom lived more than a day's march from a defensible refuge, a systematic answer to the exact tactical advantage, speed and surprise against undefended targets that had made Viking raiding so devastatingly effective everywhere else. In this story, he reorganised the military service owed by Wessex landholders so that a standing force could always be kept in the field without stripping the kingdom's farms bare of labour at harvest time, and he commissioned the beginning of that same Anglo-Saxon chronicle we have already mentioned, a year-by-year national record maintained, in various versions, for more than 2 centuries after his death, that stands today as one of the single most valuable narrative sources for the whole of this era, precisely because a king who understood the power of the written record as clearly as Alfred did, made sure that his own kingdom's version of these events would be the one that survived to be read by us tonight, a detail worth filing away for when we talk, later in this story, about whose voices this history actually reaches us through, and whose do not. The Mending of England. Alfred died in the year 899, having secured Wessex's survival but having never lived to see the Danelaw itself brought back under English rule, a task that fell instead to his own children, and it is worth naming plainly that one of the 2 people most responsible for completing that task was not a king at all, but a woman, Alfred's own daughter, remembered by this later English tradition as Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, who governed the neighbouring kingdom of Mercia after her husband's death with an authority and a military competence that put her, by any honest measure, among the most effective commanders this entire story has produced, building fortified burhs of her own across the Mercian frontier, in the same systematic pattern her father had pioneered in Wessex, and leading in person campaigns that recaptured Danelaw territory town by town, her achievement later English chroniclers, writing in an age considerably less comfortable than our own, with the idea of a woman commanding armies, tended to compress and minimise rather than celebrate, a quiet injustice worth naming and correcting here, since Ethelfled's brother, Edward the Elder, ruling Wessex itself, receives in the very same sources a far more generous share of the credit for a reconquest that the 2 siblings, by any careful reading of the actual campaign record, appear to have carried out very much as partners. It was Edward's own son, Alfred's grandson, a king remembered as Ethelstan, who finally completed what his grandfather had begun, extending West Saxon and Mercian authority over the last independent Viking kingdom centred on York, and securing, by the year 927, the first submission of all the other rulers of Britain, Scots, Welsh and Northumbrian alike. to a single English overlord, a moment later historians have come to treat as the genuine founding point of a unified kingdom of England, rather than a patchwork of rival Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian territories. And Aethelstan sealed that unification a decade later in one of the single largest and most consequential battles fought anywhere in Britain during this entire era, at a place called Brunanburh in 937, whose exact location no modern historian has been able to identify with full confidence, but whose outcome no source disputes. A combined invasion force of the King of Dublin's own Norse fleet, allied with the King of Scotland and the King of Strathclyde, all of them alarmed at Aethelstan's growing power and hoping to break it before it could grow any further. Meeting Aethelstan's own combined West Saxon and Mercian army in a single enormous and extraordinarily bloody engagement that a contemporary poem preserved inside the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself, composed in the same alliterative heroic verse tradition the Norse skalds themselves would have recognised, celebrates as a slaughter so complete that 5 kings and 7 of the Dublin ruler's own earls were said to have been left dead on the field. Aethelstan's victory at Brunanburh secured for a generation the unity his grandfather Alfred could only have dreamed of achieving, though it is worth naming in keeping with this story's own recurring insistence on refusing tidy, permanent endings, that Scandinavian kings would recapture York more than once in the decades that followed Aethelstan's own death, and that full, final, unshakable English unity would not truly arrive until considerably later still. A reminder that even the tide's retreat, in this story as in the literal tide it is named for, was never a single clean withdrawal, but a long, uneven, repeatedly reversing process stretched across generations. Cities built by raiders, while the tide rose and eventually receded across Wessex and the Danelaw, a parallel and in some ways even more transformative story was unfolding across the Irish Sea, in a land whose relationship with the Viking raiders would prove over time to be one of the most complicated and most creatively productive in this entire history. Ireland in the early 9th century, like England, was no single unified kingdom but a landscape of competing regional dynasties and a high king whose authority was, in practice, considerably more symbolic than absolute, its wealth concentrated. As we have already seen was the pattern everywhere in this story. In a remarkable density of undefended monasteries, some of them, like the great monastic city of Clonmacnoise on the River Shannon, functioning as genuine centres of population, scholarship and craft production, rather than simple religious retreats. And it was exactly this concentration of wealth without corresponding defence that drew Viking raiders to Irish shores in growing numbers from the 820s onward, striking coastal and riverine monasteries with the same repeated, grinding persistence we have already watched play out along the rivers of Francia. What set the Irish experience apart and what makes it worth a dedicated section of its own in this story is what happened once the raiding began to give way, as it so often did elsewhere in this story, to settlement. Around the year 841, a Viking fleet established a fortified base at the mouth of the River Liffey on Ireland's east coast, a type of defensible riverside encampment the Irish annalists called a long fort, literally a ship fortress, intended initially as nothing more than a secure winter base from which raiding parties could strike inland, and to which they could retreat with their plunder. And that particular long fort, unlike a great many others established and abandoned across Ireland in these same decades, never went away. It grew, across the following generations, from a raider's winter camp into a genuine town, a centre of trade and craft, and before long of a substantial and permanent mixed Norse and Irish population, and that town survives today, considerably larger and considerably changed, but standing on essentially the same ground, as the modern city of Dublin, a fact worth sitting with for a moment, because it means that one of the great capital cities of modern Europe owes its very existence quite directly to a Viking raiding camp, and Dublin was very far from alone in this. Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick, four more of Ireland's most important historic port cities, all trace their origins to Viking-founded trading settlements established across these same decades. A legacy of urban foundation that stands, in this story, as one of the clearest possible pieces of evidence that raiding and settlement were never two separate, opposed activities in the Viking world, but two faces of the very same expansion arriving in the same ships, very often carried out in sequence by the very same men. The relationship between these Norse settlements and the Irish kingdoms around them settled, across the 10th and early 11th centuries, into something considerably more complicated than simple ongoing warfare, a pattern of shifting alliance and rivalry in which Norse-Irish Dublin, ruled by its own line of Hiberno-Norse kings, intermarried with, traded with and fought alongside Irish dynasties just as readily as it fought against them, Norse warriors serving as mercenaries in Irish dynastic quarrels, and Irish kings drawing on Dublin's wealth and its fleet in their own campaigns against rival Irish kingdoms, a genuinely blended political world that the older, simpler story of pagan raiders against Christian defenders does not begin to capture. That blended world reached its most famous single flashpoint in the year 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, fought just outside Dublin between a coalition led by the Irish High King Brian Boru, a genuinely formidable figure who had spent decades consolidating an unprecedented degree of authority over rival Irish kingdoms, and a combined force of the King of Dublin's own Hiberno-Norse forces alongside allied Viking fighters drawn from as far away as the Orkney Islands and the Isle of Man, though it is worth naming honestly, because later Irish tradition tends to romanticise the battle into a clean contest of Irish Christian nation against foreign Viking invader, that the Irish side at Clontarf itself included plenty of Irish rivals of Brian Boru fighting against him, just as the Dublin Viking coalition included Irish allies fighting alongside it, a reminder that by 1014 the line between Norse and Irish, in this eerily intermixed corner of the Viking world, had blurred nearly to the point of vanishing. Brian Boru's forces won the battle, at a cost that included Brian's own life, killed, according to later and much embellished Irish tradition, in his own tent by a fleeing Viking warrior, even as the battle outside was already won, and Clontarf came to be remembered, in the centuries of Irish storytelling that followed, as the battle that broke Viking power in Ireland for good, though modern historians tend to view that framing with real caution since Norse Dublin itself continued to exist, to trade, and to matter politically for generations after 1014, its eventual absorption into a fully Irish, and later a fully English and Anglo-Norman political order, coming not from a single battlefield, but from the same slow, uneven, tide-like withdrawal that we will see play out in one form or another, across nearly every corner of this story before the night is through. The islands that became Norse. Before we leave the Irish Sea and its surrounding waters behind, it is worth naming a scattering of smaller places that this story could easily rush past, but that deserve a moment of their own, because nowhere else in this entire account did Scandinavian settlement take hold quite so completely, or last quite so long, as it did across the northern and western islands of Britain, a fact that still shapes the culture and even the everyday speech of these places today. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, lying north of the Scottish mainland and considerably closer by open water to Norway than to Edinburgh, were settled by the Norse farmers so thoroughly from the 9th century onward that the existing native population, whatever it had been, was almost entirely displaced or absorbed, and the islands became, for the following 6 centuries, not merely a Norse-settled territory loosely attached to Scandinavia, but a fully organised Norse earldom, ruled by a continuous line of Norwegian jarls whose own sagas, the Orkneyinga saga chief among them, record generations of local feud, ambition and, in time, Christian piety in exactly the same narrative style as the more famous Icelandic family sagas. The Norse earldom of Orkney did not pass out of Scandinavian hands through conquest or through any dramatic final battle at all, but through the same kind of quiet dynastic bookkeeping that had once made Rollo a Duke of the French crown. In 1468, the King of Norway and Denmark, needing to raise a dowry for his daughter's marriage to the King of Scotland, pledged Orkney and Shetland to the Scottish crown as security for a debt he was never able to repay, a pawned mortgage that Scotland, quite understandably, never returned. Which means that these islands passed from Norse to Scottish rule not on any battlefield, but in a royal financial transaction. 6 full centuries after the first Norse settlers ever arrived there, and Shetland's own dialect and place names carry to this day a density of Norse linguistic inheritance considerably heavier than anywhere else in the British Isles, a living echo of 600 years under a Scandinavian crown. Further south and west, the Hebrides and the Isle of Man tell a similarly layered story, settled and ruled across these same centuries by a Norse Gaelic aristocracy, whose most famous surviving representative may well be a single, extraordinary hoard of ornately carved walrus ivory chess pieces, discovered on the Isle of Lewis in 1831 and known ever since as the Lewis Chessmen, a set of pieces, most now held in the British Museum and the National Museum of Scotland, whose carved bishops, kings, queens, and famously wide-eyed shield-biting warrior rooks offer one of the single most vivid and most charming surviving windows into the material culture and the sense of humour of this Norse Gaelic island world, evidence that the same craftsmen capable of the ferocious shipprow carvings at Oseberg could turn their skill just as readily toward a quiet winter's evening game shared between neighbours. The Isle of Man, smaller still, retained its own Norse-founded parliament, the Tynwald, an open-air assembly descended directly from the same thing-based legal tradition we have already met at Iceland's own Althing, continuously in session by the island's own proud and well-documented claim, since sometime around the year 979, which would make it, if that claim holds, the oldest continuously functioning parliament anywhere on Earth, a governing body still meeting to this day on the very same hillside its Norse founders chose more than 1,000 years ago. One more piece of evidence gathered here alongside all the others this story has collected tonight, that the word Viking, wherever you look closely enough at the actual record these people left behind, always turns out to mean considerably more than the raiding alone. How the terror actually worked. Having now followed the tide across England, Francia and Ireland, it is worth pausing the chronological march of this story to ask a more focused question, one that sits at the very heart of tonight's title. What precisely made Viking raiding so uniquely and so persistently terrifying to the societies it struck, beyond the simple fact of violence itself, since medieval Europe was, in nearly every century of its existence, no stranger to war, to raiding, to the burning of towns and the killing of the defenceless. Christian kingdoms fought each other constantly across this entire period. Frankish kings raided each other's territory, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms warred among themselves, and none of that ordinary homegrown violence produced anything resembling the specific, almost superstitious dread that the word Northman came to carry in the chronicles and the church prayers of this era, untangling that specific terror, separating what was genuinely unique about the Viking threat from what was simply the ordinary brutality of any medieval war dressed up by frightened chroniclers in extra menace because the attackers were foreign and pagan, is one of the more delicate tasks this story has to perform, and it deserves real careful attention rather than a quick gesture toward horned helmets and berserk fury. Part of the answer, and we've already spent real time on it, is simple unpredictability of a kind no other threat in this world could match. A Frankish or Anglo-Saxon peasant living through a war between neighbouring Christian kingdoms could reasonably expect that war to follow a recognisable seasonal and geographic logic. Armies marching along known roads at known times of year, sieges announced by the visible approach of a besieging force, a rhythm of violence that, however terrible, was at least legible, predictable enough to plan around, to flee in good time, to negotiate with. A Viking raiding fleet obeyed none of that logic. It could appear, as Lindisfarne's monks discovered, on any stretch of coast, at any time the weather and the tide permitted, strike within hours of first being sighted, and vanish again long before any organised response could be summoned. A form of violence that denied its victims the basic comfort of anticipation. And it is worth naming honestly that this unpredictability was not an accident of Viking tactics, but very often their entire point, the central strategic advantage that the longship's speed and shallow draft existed specifically to deliver. Since a raiding party that could strike and withdraw before an enemy could organise resistance never actually needed to defeat a large defending force in open battle at all, only to outrun the news of its own arrival. Part of the answer, too, lies in the specific and deliberately calculated symbolism of the targets these raiders chose, at least in the raiding's earliest decades. The monasteries struck again and again across this story. Lindisfarne, Iona, Clonmacnoise and so many others were not simply undefended and wealthy, though they were seriously both of those things. They were also, to the Christian societies that built and cherished them, sacred in a way that made their violation feel less like ordinary theft and more like an assault on the moral order of the universe itself, an attack on God's own protection that, in the theology of the age, ought to have been unthinkable. And the shock recorded in Alcuin's letters after Lindisfarne, the sense that some fundamental boundary of the sacred had been violated by men, who apparently either did not know or did not care that it existed, was very likely, for the Christian societies experiencing it, genuinely more disorienting than an equivalent raid on an ordinary undefended village would have produced, because it suggested the existence of an enemy entirely outside the shared moral universe that even the most hostile Christian rivals still at some level inhabited. And part of the answer, it deserves to be said honestly rather than politely smoothed over, is that Viking raiders did in fact sometimes employ genuine and deliberate psychological terror as a calculated weapon of war, though it is worth separating carefully what the contemporary and near-contemporary evidence actually supports from what later legend, both medieval and modern, has layered on top of it. The image of the so-called blood eagle, a supposed ritual execution in which a defeated enemy's ribs were cut from his spine and spread like wings, is one that deserves particular caution, since it appears only in a small handful of much later Norse literary sources, composed centuries after the events they describe, and a real and lively scholarly debate exists over whether it describes an actual historical practice at all, or whether it began instead as a poetic and deliberately gruesome literary image, perhaps even a misreading of an older skaldic verse describing eagles feeding on a battlefield corpse's back, that later saga writers took literally and elaborated into ritual, and a story that repeats the blood eagle uncritically as established historical fact without naming that uncertainty is not telling you the truth about how thin the evidence for it actually is. Something very similar has to be said with the same careful honesty about the berserker, that image of a Norse warrior fighting in a trance-like frenzy so complete that he felt no pain, no fear and no restraint, biting his own shield, howling like a wild animal, and cutting down friend and foe alike in an uncontrollable killing rage, an image that does appear, considerably more often than the blood eagle, in near-contemporary Norse sources, including several skaldic poems composed within living memory of the events they describe, which lends the berserker at least somewhat firmer historical footing, though the precise mechanism behind the frenzy remains to this day a subject modern scholars argue over with real energy, some pointing to self-induced psychological states cultivated through ritual, chanting and expectation, not unlike the battle trance reported across many other warrior cultures worldwide, others to the possible ingestion of alcohol or of hallucinogenic substances, a theory involving the mind-altering fungus ergot, which can grow on stored grain that has never been conclusively demonstrated, and that most serious historians now treat with real skepticism, and still others suspecting that at least some portion of the berserker reputation like so much else in this story, grew through calculated performance and reputation building as much as through any literal altered state at all. A terrifying persona cultivated deliberately because an enemy who believed you fought without fear or pain was an enemy already half defeated before the first blow ever landed. Whatever its true mechanism, real or performed or some blend of both, the Berserker's reputation did exactly the work this section has already described the Blood Eagle's reputation doing, regardless of how literally the practice was actually carried out. It travelled ahead of the army that carried it, and it made the next town's defenders just a little less certain of their own courage before a single Norse ship had even come into view. What is much better attested, across multiple independent and broadly contemporary sources, is a Viking willingness to use captured hostages, mass executions of prisoners, and the deliberate, well-publicised slaughter of a defeated force's leadership as tools of psychological warfare, terror deployed with calculation, to make the next town along the coast surrender its silver quickly, rather than risk a fight it had already watched its neighbours lose. And it is this calculated reputational use of visible brutality intended to be talked about, to travel ahead of the fleet along the coast roads faster than the ships themselves could sail, that comes closest, among all the explanations this story has offered so far, to explaining why the fear of the Northmen settled so deeply and so durably into the religious and political imagination of an entire continent, the shape of an ordinary day. Let us slow down for a moment, here in the middle of this long night, and set the burning monasteries aside entirely, because it is worth spending real time inside the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a life that most Viking Age Scandinavians, women and men and children alike, actually lived, since the raiders themselves, when they were not raiding, went home to exactly this same world, and a story that only ever shows you the sword arm and never the hearth is not showing you the whole of the person holding it. A typical farmstead of this period centred on a longhouse, a single long, low, timber-framed building, with walls of wattle and daub or turf, its roof thickly thatched or turfed against the cold, its interior a single open hall, warmed by a long central hearth whose smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof rather than any chimney. The same space serving, depending on the season and the hour, as kitchen, workshop, dining hall and sleeping quarters for an extended household that might include grandparents, parents, children, servants and thralls all together. Their livestock very often stabled at the far end of that very same building through the hardest months of winter, both for the animals' own protection from the cold and for the considerable warmth their bodies added to a house that needed every source of heat it could gather against an Arctic or sub-Arctic winter's dark. The Viking Age diet, reconstructed by archaeologists from the discarded animal bones, fish scales and preserved plant remains recovered from farmstead middens across Scandinavia, Iceland and the Danelaw, was built around barley and rye bread, porridge, dairy products in extraordinary variety, including a fermented, semi-liquid soured milk called skyer that Icelanders still eat today, under almost exactly the same name, meat from cattle, sheep, goats and pigs, slaughtered in autumn and preserved through smoking, salting or drying for the long winter ahead, and, along nearly every stretch of this story's coastline, an enormous quantity of fish, herring and cod above all, caught, dried and traded in a fishing economy so extensive that dried Norwegian stockfish would remain one of medieval and early modern Scandinavia's most important exports for centuries after the Viking Age itself had ended. Clothing was woven, at home, almost entirely by the women of the household, from wool and for the wealthy, imported linen and silk, dyed in colours, madder red and woad blue among them, that archaeological textile analysis has shown were considerably brighter and more varied than the drab, undyed greys and browns that popular imagination often assigns this period. Men typically wearing a long wool tunic over trousers, Women a long dress often fastened at the shoulders with a pair of distinctive oval brooches that archaeologists now use, more reliably than almost any other single artefact, to identify a Norse female burial anywhere across this whole story's enormous geographic range, from a farmstead in Iceland to a river camp on the Volga. Children in this world grew up expected to work from a young age, herding, gathering, and, for boys of a warrior or landowning family, training early with the wooden practice swords and small bows that archaeologists have recovered from children's graves, but they also, in the long dark stretches of a Scandinavian winter, played, and it is worth naming gently some of what that play looked like, because it complicates in its own small way the unrelieved grimness of so much of tonight's story. Board games, chief among them a strategy game called Hnefatafl King's Table, played on a checkered board with unequal forces, a besieged king and his defenders against a larger surrounding army of attackers, a game whose carved wooden and bone pieces turn up again and again in graves and settlements across the entire Norse world, from Ireland to the Russ River towns, ice skates carved from the leg bones of horses and cattle, strapped to the feet and used to cross frozen lakes and fjords at speed through the winter months, and for adults, a rough, ferocious form of wrestling called glima, still practiced in Iceland today as a living link to this same distant past, alongside feats of strength and swimming contests that the sagas describe with the same relish they bring to their battle scenes, evidence, taken all together, of a society that filled its winters with exactly the kind of games, sport and friendly rivalry that any ordinary farming community, anywhere and in any age, has always used to pass a long, cold, housebound season. And it is worth naming too the craftsmanship that went into the weapons this story has spent so much of its time describing in use, because the sword, above every other weapon, carried a symbolic weight in Norse warrior culture that went well beyond its practical function, a status object as much as a tool of war, and the finest blades of this entire period, prized above all others and traded across the whole of this story's geographic range at extraordinary cost, were a type of pattern-welded steel sword inscribed near the hilt, with the maker's mark Ulfbergt, blades whose iron chemical analysis conducted by modern metallurgists has shown, was considerably purer and more consistently forged than almost anything else being produced in contemporary Europe, likely originating from a single Frankish workshop or a closely guarded family tradition of workshops whose actual methods and actual location remain to this day, a genuine unsolved mystery of medieval metallurgy, since the technique required a furnace temperature and a level of quality control that European ironworking would not reliably reproduce again for centuries after the Viking Age itself had ended. A sword good enough, and rare enough, that a single Ulfberht blade, recovered from graves as far apart as Norway and the Volga River Valley, could represent on its own the accumulated wealth of an entire successful raiding or trading career. Alongside the sword sat the axe, a considerably more common and more affordable weapon that most ordinary free farmers, unable to afford imported steel swords, carried instead, equally deadly in trained hands and doubling in peacetime, as an ordinary tool for felling the timber. This whole shipbuilding culture depended on, and the round, brightly painted wooden shield, carried in a defensive wall formation whose basic tactical logic, overlapping shields presenting an unbroken barrier to an advancing enemy, while spears and swords worked from behind and beside it. This story has already watched decide the outcome of battles from Ashdown to Hastings, whichever side of that particular shield wall happened on a given day, to hold its nerve and its formation the longest, the road to Miklagard. So far this story has followed the tide westward and southward, into Britain, Ireland and Francia, and it would be easy, listening only to that part of the story, to imagine the entire Viking phenomenon as a purely Western and purely Atlantic one. It was not, and the eastward expansion of Scandinavian traders raiders and settlers across this same period into the river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, and from there down toward the wealthiest city on earth at the time, deserves just as much of our attention tonight, both because it is a genuinely remarkable story in its own right and because it shows us a side of the Viking world considerably less defined by raiding than the burning monasteries of Northumbria and Francia might have led you to expect. The Scandinavians who moved east in these centuries, most of them originating from what is now Sweden, whose eastern coastline sat closest to the mouths of the great rivers that drained into the Baltic, came to be known in the sources that describe them by a name that has echoed forward into modern history in a way almost none of this story's other names has: the Russ, a term of disputed but probably Scandinavian origin that would eventually give its name to the land, and the people we call Russia to this day. These eastern Scandinavians were, from nearly the very beginning of their involvement in the region, traders first and raiders only secondarily, drawn not by undefended monasteries, since the Slavic and Finnic peoples of this vast river-laced territory built comparatively few of the kind of portable, concentrated ecclesiastical wealth that had made Western Christendom such an inviting target, but by something considerably more valuable and considerably more durable: access, by way of the great river systems of the Volga and the Dnieper, both of which could be reached from the Baltic through a network of smaller rivers, lakes, and short overland portages, across which a longship, light enough to be dragged on rollers by its own crew, could be hauled from one waterway to the next, to the fabulously wealthy markets of the Islamic world along the Volga's southern reaches, and, further south still, down the Dnieper, to the single richest and most sophisticated city that either the Rus, or, for that matter, most of the rest of Christian Europe, had ever heard of: Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the eastern half of the old Roman Empire, a city the Norse themselves came to call Miklagard, the Great City, a name that tells you, all on its own, exactly how it must have looked to a trader arriving from a Scandinavian farmstead or a Kievan river settlement, its walls, its churches, its markets, and its sheer scale dwarfing anything else these travellers had ever laid eyes on. Later Rus tradition recorded in a chronicle called the Primary Chronicle, compiled by monks in Kiev considerably later than the events it describes, and therefore a source we need to handle with the same careful scepticism we have applied to every other later chronicle in this story, credits the founding of organised Rus rule over the local Slavic population to a Scandinavian chieftain named Rurik, who is said to have been invited, along with his followers, to rule over the feuding local tribes around the town of Novgorod in the year 862, a foundation story that later Russian and Soviet historians would argue over for political reasons, stretching all the way into the 20th century, since the idea that Russia's earliest organised state owed its founding to invited Scandinavian outsiders rather than to indigenous Slavic initiative became, at various points, an uncomfortable one for nationalist historical narratives to accommodate, and it is worth naming that scholarly argument honestly here, both because it shows how the distant Viking past can still carry real political weight in the present, and because the archaeological evidence, whatever the precise truth of Rurik's own story, does support a real and substantial Scandinavian presence integrated into the trade, the fortifications, and eventually the ruling elite of these earliest Rusin population centres. From Novgorod, the centre of Rus power moved south within a generation or two to the town of Kiev, positioned directly on the Dnieper River and therefore ideally placed to control the single most important trade route connecting the Baltic world to Constantinople, a route later sources called evocatively the road from the Varangians to the Greeks, Varangian being the term Byzantine, and Eastern sources generally used for Scandinavian traders, warriors and mercenaries operating in this eastern sphere. Along that road moved a trade of genuinely extraordinary value in both directions: furs, honey, wax, and most lucratively, and most troublingly of all, enslaved people, captured in raids on neighbouring Slavic and Finnic populations, and transported south along the river routes to be sold in the slave markets of Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphate beyond it, a trade so central to the Rus economy of this period that the very Arabic word for a Rus trader, as recorded by contemporary Islamic geographers and travellers, is sometimes argued by linguists to be etymologically connected to the trade in captives itself. And it is worth sitting with that fact honestly, rather than passing over it quickly, because the Eastern Viking world's wealth, quite as much as the Western raiders' plunder from Frankish and English monasteries, rested substantially on human bodies bought and sold as commodities, a grim thread running underneath this entire story that deserves to be named plainly rather than left as an implied footnote. One of the single most vivid surviving descriptions of these Eastern Rus traders comes to us not from any Norse or Christian source at all, but from an Arab diplomat and writer named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who travelled along the Volga River in the year 922 as part of an embassy sent by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to a Turkic Khanate further north, and who recorded in an account that survives and that modern historians treat as one of the single most valuable eyewitness sources for Viking Age Eastern Scandinavian culture that we possess, a detailed and famously unsentimental description of a group of Rus traders he encountered camped along the riverbank. Ibn Fadlan describes them as physically the most perfect specimens of humanity he has ever seen, tall, fair and heavily tattooed, and in the very next breath describes them as the filthiest of God's creatures in their personal hygiene, washing their hands and faces each morning in a single shared basin of water that every man in the camp used in turn without changing it, a detail that has amused and unsettled readers of Ibn Fadlan's account in roughly equal measure ever since. But the single most famous and most extensively documented portion of his account describes something considerably darker: the funeral of a Rus chieftain, a lengthy and elaborate ritual involving the ceremonial burning of the dead man's ship, richly furnished with grave goods, and, at the very centre of the rite, the ritual killing of a young enslaved woman who had, according to Ibn Fadlan's careful and evidently deeply unsettled description, volunteered, or been selected under intense social pressure that makes the very word volunteer worth placing in careful quotation marks, to die alongside her master and accompany him into the next world, killed by strangulation and stabbing after a period of ritualized drinking, singing and sexual intercourse with several of the dead man's companions that Ibn Fadlan describes in disturbingly matter-of-fact detail, before her body was placed aboard the ship alongside her master's and the whole vessel put to the torch. It is worth letting that account sit exactly as uncomfortably as it deserves to sit, because it is one of our clearest single windows into the actual lived brutality that the institution of Viking Age slavery could produce at its most extreme, described not by a hostile Christian chronicler with an obvious motive to make pagan raiders look monstrous, but by a careful, curious, and generally quite fair-minded outside observer, with no particular stake in exaggerating what he saw. The Rus, having built their power along these river routes, did not confine themselves to trade alone with the great city at the southern end of their road. On several occasions across the 9th and 10th centuries, Rus fleets sailed directly against Constantinople itself, most famously in the year 860, when a Rus raiding force appeared before the city's walls so suddenly and so unexpectedly that the Byzantine emperor, who was away campaigning elsewhere at the time, had to hurry back to defend a capital that had received no warning whatsoever of the attack, an assault that a leading churchman of Constantinople, the Patriarch Photius, describes in a surviving sermon with an alarm and a bewilderment that echoes, across an entirely different sea and an entirely different culture, the very same shock Alcuin had recorded after Lindisfarne some 70 years before, right down to a shared sense that this obscure, previously unheard of northern people had appeared from nowhere to strike at the very heart of a great and settled civilization. Later Rus assaults on Constantinople met with mixed success, and the relationship between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire settled across the 10th century into the same familiar pattern this story has now shown us repeatedly. An evolution from raiding toward a far more durable and far more mutually profitable relationship of trade, diplomacy, and eventually formal alliance, sealed by trade treaties concluded first under a Rus ruler named Oleg in the year 911, and renewed under his successor Igor in styles that survive remarkably in the primary chronicle's own text, quoted there in enough detail that modern historians can read, essentially verbatim, the actual negotiated terms under which this story's eastern raiders were finally converted into recognised and regulated trading partners of the Byzantine state. Rus merchants arriving at Constantinople were required, under these treaties, to enter the city only through a single designated gate, unarmed and in groups no larger than 50 at a time, escorted by an imperial official who verified their identity and their goods, permitted to lodge and trade for a fixed period at imperial expense, receiving a set monthly allowance of bread, wine, meat and fish while their business was conducted, before being required to depart again, before winter closed the Black Sea's northern approaches to navigation, a set of carefully calibrated rules that reads, all these centuries later, like nothing so much as the fine print of a hard-won modern trade agreement, and that tells us, more plainly than almost any other single document this story has quoted tonight, exactly how far the relationship between Miklagard and the Rus had travelled in barely 2 generations, from the sudden, terrifying, unannounced raid of 860 to a formally negotiated, closely supervised, and evidently quite lucrative arrangement that both sides had every reason to want to preserve. That same relationship culminated in one of the more genuinely consequential religious turning points in all of Eastern European history, in the conversion, in the year 988, of the Rus ruler Vladimir of Kiev to Orthodox Christianity, a decision that bound the emerging Rus state permanently to the religious, artistic and political orbit of Byzantium rather than that of Rome, a choice whose consequences would help shape the entire subsequent religious and cultural history of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus for the 1,000 years that followed. And it is worth naming, finally, one further and genuinely remarkable institution that grew directly out of this Eastern Viking world, the Varangian Guard, an elite personal bodyguard maintained by the Byzantine emperors themselves, recruited substantially from Scandinavian and, in later centuries, increasingly from Anglo-Saxon warriors who travelled east specifically to take service in it, prized by successive emperors precisely because these foreign warriors, without any local family ties, local political factions, or local ambitions of their own to advance, could be trusted with the emperor's own personal safety in a way that a native Byzantine guard entangled in the endlessly shifting palace politics of Constantinople often could not. Norse runestones raised back home in Sweden, a number of which survive and can still be visited today, record, in brief and often quite moving inscriptions, the names of local men who travelled east to Miklagard and never returned, commemorated by grieving families who raised a carved stone in their memory on a farm in the Swedish countryside because there was no grave nearer than the far side of the Black Sea to mark instead, a detail worth holding on to, because it reminds us that behind every grand story of trade routes and imperial guards and riverborne empires, there were always, in the end, ordinary families back home in Scandinavia, waiting for sons and brothers who had gone east, chasing fortune, and had simply, one season, stopped coming home, into the empty water. If the eastward expansion of the Rus shows us the Viking world at its most commercially minded, the westward expansion across the open North Atlantic shows us this same seafaring culture at its most purely exploratory, sailing not toward wealthy cities or wealthy monasteries at all, in this case, but out into water that, so far as anyone in Scandinavia knew when the voyages began, might hold nothing at all, and it is a story that deserves real time in this telling, both for its own sake because it complicates, more thoroughly than almost anything else in this whole account. The image of the Viking as purely a raider and nothing more. Iceland, a large volcanic island sitting several hundred miles of open, frequently violent North Atlantic water away from both Norway and the British Isles, appears to have been reached first, according to later Icelandic tradition, by chance when ships bound for other destinations were blown off course, and then, deliberately and with growing confidence, by settlers beginning in the 870s, a wave of settlement traditional accounts associate with a chieftain named Ingolfur Arnason, credited by later Icelandic writers as the island's first permanent settler, arriving, according to the same later and not fully verifiable tradition, at the site that would become the island's capital, and that still carries to this day the name he is said to have given it, Reykjavik, meaning Smoky Bay, after the geothermal steam rising from the ground there. The settlement of Iceland across the following decades drew in real and substantial part on precisely the political pressures we discussed earlier in this story. Disaffected chieftains and their followers pushed out of an increasingly centralised Norway under kings like Harald Fairhair. Men who preferred the hardship of building a new life on a remote, largely treeless volcanic island, its interior an uninhabitable wasteland of glacier and lava field. Its narrow, habitable coastal fringe nonetheless capable, in these early centuries before centuries of overgrazing and soil erosion had taken their toll, of supporting a genuinely productive farming and fishing economy, to submission before a king they had no wish to serve. It is worth naming, too, that these earlier settlers were very far from exclusively men, and one figure in particular, recorded in the great medieval Icelandic register of the island's original settlers known as the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, deserves to be named here in her own right rather than folded anonymously into the phrase disaffected chieftains and their followers. A woman remembered as Aud or Un, the deep-minded, daughter of a Norse chieftain who had carved out his own petty kingdom in the Hebrides, married in turn to a Viking king of Dublin, and widowed, along with the later loss of her own son, in the chaotic Norse-Irish politics this story has already described, before she herself organised and led an entire household expedition west to Iceland, commanding, according to the saga tradition that preserves her story, her own ship, claiming a substantial tract of land for herself under exactly the same legal terms that governed a male settler's claim, and distributing portions of that land afterward to her own loyal followers, as any founding chieftain, male or female, was entitled to do, a career that the Landnámabók records with the same matter-of-fact respect it extends to its male settlers, evidence worth holding on to here alongside everything else this story has already said about Norse women's legal standing. That widowhood and personal loss could, for a woman of sufficient rank, resource, and resolve, open a path to genuine independent authority in this society that a comparable Christian widow further south, bound by canon law and by a husband's surviving male relatives, would very rarely have been permitted to walk. And it is worth naming because it matters enormously for how we understand what kind of society these settlers built, that the Iceland these settlers created had for centuries no king at all, but instead a remarkable and genuinely distinctive form of decentralised self-governance built around an annual General Assembly called the Althing, established around the year 930 and held every summer at a dramatic Rift Valley site called Thingvellir, where free farmers and chieftains from across the island gathered to hear disputes argued, laws proclaimed aloud from memory by a designated law speaker in an age before the Assembly's laws were ever written down, and judgments rendered by a rotating body of regional chieftains, an institution of remarkable sophistication for its time, and one that modern Icelanders take real and justified pride in, since the Althing is regularly cited as among the oldest continuously functioning representative assemblies anywhere in the world, a genuinely striking legacy to trace back to a colony founded, in real part, by men fleeing exactly the kind of centralising royal authority that assembly was built to do without. From Iceland, the same restless push toward the horizon carried Scandinavian settlement further still. Around the year 982, according to later saga tradition, a settler named Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland after killing a man in a dispute, a fairly ordinary kind of violent quarrel by the standards of Icelandic saga society, sailed west in search of a land that Icelandic sailors had glimpsed but never properly explored, and found on the far side of a stretch of open water a large and genuinely forbidding Arctic island whose interior was almost entirely buried beneath a permanent ice cap, but whose narrow southwestern coastal fjords, in the somewhat milder climatic conditions of this particular period of medieval history, offered grazing and farmland good enough to support a real settlement. Eric named the place Greenland, a name later tradition claims he chose quite deliberately and quite cynically as an act of early real estate marketing, reasoning, according to the saga account, that people would be more inclined to follow him there if the land had an attractive name, and whatever the precise truth of that particular anecdote, the marketing, if that is what it was, worked. A fleet of colonising ships followed Eric back to Greenland around the year 985, and a genuine, if always small and always precarious Norse settlement took root there, eventually growing to a population numbering at its height several thousand people spread across two main settlement districts, sustained by farming, hunting, and crucially, by trade with Norway and Iceland in walrus ivory and polar bear pelts, valuable exotic goods that helped this remote and marginal colony punch for a time well above its economic weight in the wider Norse trading world. It was from this same Greenland colony, and this brings us to what is, by any reasonable measure, the single most remarkable geographic achievement in this entire story, that Scandinavian sailors pushed on one step further still, reaching, around the year 1000, the coast of North America itself, a full 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus's famous voyage would reintroduce the existence of that continent to the rest of Europe. According to Icelandic saga tradition, recorded, like so much of this story's most vivid detail, considerably later than the events it describes, a sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson sighted an unfamiliar coastline while blown off course on a voyage toward Greenland, and it was Eric the Red's own son, a man remembered in history as Leif Erikson, who organised and led the first deliberate expedition to actually land on and explore that coastline, naming the lands he found in sequence as he sailed south along an unfamiliar shore: Helluland, a land of flat stones, likely corresponding to part of Baffin Island; Markland, a land of forests, likely part of the coast of Labrador; and finally, further south still, a land mild and fertile enough to support wild grapevines, which Leif and his companions named Vinland, Wineland, a place whose precise modern location saga scholars and archaeologists debated for generations without full resolution, until in 1960, Norwegian archaeologist Helge and Anne Steiner Ingstad uncovered, at a site called Lanzo Meadow on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in modern Canada, the unmistakable remains of a genuine Norse settlement, complete with the distinctive turf-walled longhouses, iron rivets, and a small iron smithy of unmistakably Scandinavian construction, dated by later archaeological work to right around the year 1000, physical, undeniable, scientifically dated proof that the sagas' account of a Norse landfall in North America, so long treated by sceptical historians as pure legend, described a real and physically verifiable event. The Norse presence at Vinland, whatever precisely it encompassed beyond the single confirmed site at Lanzo Meadows, which most archaeologists now believe functioned as a base camp and ship repair station for further, still not fully located exploration rather than as the entirety of the Norse presence in the region, did not last. The sagas that describe these voyages, chiefly the saga of the Greenland Dinders and Eric the Red saga, two accounts that disagree with each other on a number of specific details in a way that itself tells us something honest about how oral tradition drifts and diverges across the generations before it is finally written down, describe repeated and increasingly violent conflict between the small Norse expeditions and the indigenous peoples they encountered there, people the sagas call, in a term that later ages would rightly recognise as pejorative, scraelings, conflict that the heavily outnumbered Norse settlers, thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement, were simply never in a position to sustain over the long term. And archaeological evidence more broadly suggests that whatever Norse activity continued in this region across the following decades or even centuries likely limited expeditions to gather timber, a resource desperately scarce back in treeless Greenland and Iceland, rather than any sustained further attempt at permanent settlement. It never grew into anything resembling the durable colonies the Norse had established in Iceland or, for a time, in Greenland itself. For a time, it is worth stressing, because Greenland's own Norse colony, the base from which Leif Erikson had sailed, and the anchor point of this whole westward scurry did not last forever either, and its own ending deserves a moment of quiet attention before we leave these cold waters behind, because it is one of the more genuinely haunting mysteries this entire account has to offer. The Greenland settlements endured, trading walrus ivory and polar bear pelts back to Norway, and maintaining a resident bishop and a network of churches whose stone foundations archaeologists can still walk through today. For the better part of 4 centuries, a run of continuous European settlement in the high Arctic that would not be matched again until the modern era. But sometime across the 14th and 15th centuries, the western of the colony's 2 settlement districts fell silent first, and then, within a further century or so, the eastern settlement followed it into an equally total silence. The last confirmed written record of the Greenland Norse describing of all things a wedding, held at a church there in the year 1408. And after that, nothing, no further letters, no further ships, no further contact of any kind, until European sailors returning to the coast in the 16th and 17th centuries found the old farms abandoned and overgrown, their former inhabitants gone without a single surviving account of where, or why, or how. Historians and archaeologists have spent generations trying to explain that silence, and in keeping with this whole story's own recurring insistence on honest uncertainty rather than tidy answers, no single explanation has ever fully satisfied everyone who has studied the question. Climate almost certainly played a real part, since the period historians call the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and increasingly ice-choked shipping lanes to the whole North Atlantic beginning in the 13th century, squeezing a colony that had always depended on a narrow and unforgiving margin of arable land, even harder than the tightening land pressure we described in Norway itself at this story's very beginning. Economic isolation likely compounded the cold, as European demand for walrus ivory, the colony's single most valuable export, collapsed once new maritime routes opened direct access to African elephant ivory in far greater quantity, cutting off the trade income the settlement had always depended on to buy the iron, the timber, and the church supplies its own land could never produce. Conflict with the Inuit peoples who were themselves expanding into the same territory during these same centuries may have played a part as well, though the archaeological evidence for large-scale violence between the two populations remains thinner and more ambiguous than older accounts once assumed, and it is entirely possible, on the evidence now available, that the story's true ending was less a single dramatic catastrophe than a slow, grinding accumulation of hardship, isolation, and one bad decade following another, until a population already reduced by starvation and emigration back to Iceland and Norway simply became too small to sustain itself any further, the last handful of survivors slipping away, in ones and twos and small family groups, so quietly and so gradually that no single chronicler was ever present to record the final page of a story that had once seemed, to the confident settlers who first followed Eric the Red West, like it might last forever. It is worth pausing before we leave the Atlantic story behind and turn back toward the wars and kingdoms of Europe, to sit for a moment with what this westward voyage actually represents within the larger shape of this whole night story, because it complicates more thoroughly than any single episode we have covered so far. The word this whole video takes as its title. The same shipbuilding tradition, the same navigational mastery, and very often the very same families who produced the raiders that burned Lindisfarne and terrorised the Seine also produced the sailors who settled a barren volcanic island with no king at all and built one of the earliest representative assemblies in recorded history, and the explorers who reached 5 centuries ahead of anyone else in Europe, a second continent that the rest of the Christian world would not even know existed for another half a millennium. The word Viking, it is worth naming plainly here, was in its own original Old Norse usage, Vikinga, less an ethnic label than an activity, a verb as much as a noun, describing a specific undertaking, an armed voyage abroad in search of plunder or fortune, that any given Scandinavian man might engage in for 1 or 2 seasons of his life before returning home to farm, to trade, to marry, and to grow old as an entirely ordinary member of his community, which means that the raiders of Northumbria, the traders of the Volga, and the Atlantic settlers of Iceland and Greenland and briefly Vinland were, in a very real sense, not 3 separate peoples at all, but the very same restless, adaptable, ship-mastering Scandinavian world, turning the exact same set of hard-won skills toward whatever opportunity, violent or peaceful, a given coastline, or a given river, or a given horizon, happened that particular season to offer. Both hands held open at once. It is worth pausing here at roughly the midpoint of this long night story to gather up several threads we have already touched in passing and hold them together deliberately, because a story that spends this many hours walking you through burned monasteries and broken armies owes you, in fairness, an equally honest look at the ordinary daily texture of the society that produced all of that violence. A society that was, for the overwhelming majority of the people living inside it, not primarily engaged in raiding at all, but in the considerably less dramatic business of farming, herding, fishing, weaving, trading, and raising children, the same business that occupied most people in most of medieval Europe, Christian and pagan alike. And it is worth correcting, plainly and directly, one of the single most persistent and single most inaccurate pieces of popular imagery this whole subject carries with it before we go any further, because it has become so thoroughly embedded in modern popular culture that it deserves to be named and dismissed outright. There is no reliable archaeological or contemporary written evidence whatsoever that Viking warriors wore horned helmets into battle, an image that actual Viking Age helmets, the very small handful that survive intact, most famously one recovered from a burial at Gjermundbu in Norway, flatly contradict, showing instead simple, practical, rounded iron helmets with a nose guard and no horns of any kind, for the entirely sensible reason that a horn protruding from your own helmet gives an enemy an excellent handle to grab, twist, and use to snap your neck or unbalance you in close combat. The horned helmet, as it turns out, is a 19th century theatrical invention, popularised above all by the costume designs created for productions of the German composer Richard Wagner's operatic cycle depicting Norse mythology, a costuming choice that caught the romantic imagination of 19th century Europe so thoroughly that it has simply never let go since. A detail worth naming not as a trivial piece of pop culture trivia, but as a small useful lesson in how thoroughly a much later age's own imagination can reshape our picture of a period whose own people would not have recognised the image at all. It is worth naming too the actual position of women within Viking Age Scandinavian society, a subject historians have studied with considerably more care and considerably more nuance in recent decades than older, cruder accounts once offered. Norse women, particularly free women of the farming and landowning class, held a set of legal rights that stood out in real and documented ways, from the position of women in a great many contemporary Christian societies to the south. They could, under recorded Norse law, own property in their own right, inherit land from their families under specified circumstances, and, perhaps most strikingly by the standards of the age, initiate divorce from a husband on documented and specific legal grounds, a right that a great many medieval Christian women, bound by a canon law that made marriage effectively indissoluble except through the Church's own cumbersome and rarely granted annulment process, simply did not possess. A married woman in a Viking Age household typically held the keys to the family's stores and valuables as a physical and symbolic mark of her domestic authority, an authority that extended, in a great many documented cases, to managing the entire farm and its dependents during the long stretches, sometimes lasting years at a time, when a husband was away raiding, trading, or settled overseas, responsibilities that required real, substantial, and socially recognised competence, rather than the purely ornamental domestic role that a more cartoonish, popular image of the age tends to assign women. It is worth naming honestly in the same breath that this relative degree of legal standing did not amount to anything resembling full social or political equality by any modern measure. Political leadership, participation in the law assemblies we have already discussed, and command in war remained, with only a small handful of debated and disputed exceptions, firmly the province of men, and a woman's legal rights, real as they were, existed within a patriarchal social order that still, at its foundation, organised inheritance, marriage, and political authority around male lineage and male consent. Both of those things were true at once, and a story that only remembers one half of that picture, either the flattering modern claim of Viking women as proto-feminist warriors striding into battle beside their husbands, an image the archaeological and textual evidence supports only in a small handful of genuinely contested cases, or the older dismissive assumption that Norse women were simply chattel with no meaningful standing at all, is telling you a simpler and less honest story than the evidence actually supports. It is worth naming as well the sophistication of the legal and political culture we have already glimpsed in Iceland's Althing, because that assembly was not a uniquely Icelandic invention so much as the fullest surviving expression of an assembly-based system of law and dispute resolution that existed, in one local form or another, across the whole of the Scandinavian world, regional and local things, as these assemblies were called in Old Norse, gatherings of free landowners who met at fixed times and fixed traditional sites to hear disputes argued according to a body of customary law that was, in these earlier centuries, memorized and recited aloud by trained law speakers rather than written down. A genuinely sophisticated oral legal tradition that predates, in several of its core procedural features, the written law codes that would eventually replace it across Scandinavia in the centuries following Christian conversion. It's worth naming, too, the artistic and material culture this same society produced. An intricate, distinctive tradition of interlaced animal and geometric ornament, worked in wood, in bone, in silver, and in iron, that art historians trace through a sequence of named regional styles across the Viking centuries, and that appears on everything from the elaborately carved prow of a ship like the one recovered at Oseberg, to the smallest personal brooch worn by an ordinary farming woman to fasten her cloak. A visual language of remarkable technical skill and remarkable consistency across an enormous geographic range, evidence, in its own quiet way, of a shared cultural identity binding together communities separated by hundreds of miles of forest, fjord, and open sea. And it is worth naming the poetic tradition these same people carried, an oral culture of enormous sophistication built around two closely related but structurally distinct verse forms: Eddic poetry, which told the old mythological and heroic stories in a relatively straightforward narrative verse, and skaldic poetry, a fiendishly intricate courtly form composed by named professional poets called skalds attached to the households of specific kings and chieftains, built around complex internal rhyme, alliteration, and a dense, riddling vocabulary of metaphorical compound expressions called kennings, in which the sea might be called the whale's road and a sword the wound's flame, a poetic technology so demanding to compose correctly that surviving skaldic verse remains to this day some of the most difficult and most fascinating literature that the medieval world produced anywhere in Europe. But it would be its own kind of dishonesty, in the very same spirit that led us to correct the horned helmet and to hold both halves of the picture on women's legal standing together at once, to let this section close on nothing but ships' prows and clever kennings, because we have already, more than once tonight, brushed up against the institution that underpinned a great deal of this society's actual economic life, and it deserves a direct, unflinching look of its own rather than another passing mention. Slavery was not a peripheral or occasional feature of Viking Age Scandinavian society. It was structurally central to it, and the class of enslaved people, called thralls in Old Norse, performed an enormous share of the actual physical labour, agricultural, domestic and industrial, that Norse farms, households and workshops depended on, a labour force replenished across the whole of the Viking Age, substantially through raiding and warfare itself, captives taken in England, in Ireland, in Francia, and along the eastern river routes we have already followed toward Miklagard, marched or shipped to Scandinavian farms, to Icelandic and Greenlandic settlements, and into the slave markets of the Islamic world, where Rus traders, as we have already seen through Ibn Fadlan's own uncomfortable eyewitness account, sold captive men, women and children as one more form of tradable wealth, no different in the accounting ledgers of the age from furs or silver or amber. It is worth naming, in fairness to the fullest and most honest version of this picture, that Norse law did also recognise a path out of bondage, a formal process of manumission called frelsisol, literally freedom ale, in which an owner could grant an enslaved person their freedom, sometimes as a reward for loyal service, sometimes in exchange for a price the freed person had managed, against considerable odds, to save or to earn, a ceremony marked, as the name suggests, by a shared ritual drink that publicly transformed a thrall into a freedman with certain limited legal standing of his or her own, though it is worth naming, in the same honest breath, that a freedman's new status still sat well below that of a freeborn person in nearly every legal and social respect that survives in the record, and that manumission, however real a possibility it was, appears, on the balance of the evidence, to have been the exception granted to a fortunate few, rather than any kind of routine or expected outcome for the thousands upon thousands of people who passed through this economy in bondage, and, in the great majority of documented cases, simply stayed there for the whole of their working lives. Genetic and skeletal studies of the earliest Icelandic settler population, drawn from burial sites across the island, have found a strikingly high proportion of ancestry traceable to the British Isles rather than to Scandinavia proper, particularly among women, a pattern most historians now interpret as reflecting, at least in substantial part, the presence of enslaved or otherwise coerced Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon women brought west by Norse settlers as part of the original colonising population, a detail that complicates, in an important and necessary way, any purely celebratory telling of Iceland's famous self-governing settler society, since that society's earliest generations were built, in some real and demographically measurable part, on the forced relocation of unfree people who had no say whatsoever in the voyage that carried them there. It is worth letting that sit uncomfortably beside the Althing's genuine legal sophistication, because both of those things were, at once and without contradiction, true of the very same society, and a story told honestly owes you the discomfort of holding them together. The same discomfort long-time listeners of this channel will recognise from other nights we have spent in this chair, sitting with the darker half of a legal code or the darker half of a conqueror's ledger, and it is a discomfort this particular long night is going to ask you to hold more than once again before it finally reaches its end, a ledger that was never kept. It is worth pausing here, in the middle of this long story, to do something this channel tries to do in every story it tells, which is to sit for a moment with the people this whole grand narrative of kings and fleets and battles tends to walk straight past, because the raids and conquests and settlements we have spent these last several hours following were not experienced by the overwhelming majority of the people who lived through them, as chapters in a sweeping historical drama at all, but as sudden, specific personal catastrophe. And almost none of those individual catastrophes were ever written down by the people who suffered them. We know Bishop Higbald's name from Lindisfarne because Alcuin happened to write to him, and because that letter happened to survive. We do not know the names of the monks who were driven into the sea that morning, or of the ones sold into slavery in some market whose location no surviving record preserves, and it is worth naming plainly that this asymmetry, a bishop remembered by name across 13 centuries while the ordinary brothers who lived and prayed and died beside him vanish from the record entirely, is not a quirk of this one particular raid, but the basic condition of nearly this entire history, since literacy in this period was concentrated almost exclusively among clergy and a narrow aristocratic elite, which means that the vast majority of the people whose lives this story touched, the peasant farmers of the Frankish river valleys, the Anglo-Saxon villagers of the Danelaw, the Irish tenants of a raided monastic estate, the enslaved men and women carried east along the Volga, left no letters, no chronicles, and in the overwhelming majority of individual cases, no names at all for us to recover. We can at least gesture toward their scale, even where we cannot recover their individual faces. Modern historians studying the Danegeld payments extracted from Frankish and English kingdoms across the 9th and 10th centuries have worked, from surviving records of the coinage minted to pay them, to estimate the sheer quantity of silver these tribute payments represented, sums that, converted into the labour of an ordinary farming household taxed to help raise them, meant years of a family's surplus grain, livestock, and labour, stripped away not by a bad harvest or an ordinary lord's ordinary demands, but by an emergency none of them had any part in causing and no power whatsoever to resist. A burden that fell, as these burdens nearly always do, hardest on households with the least reserve to absorb it. It's worth naming, too, exactly what that silver actually looked like once it left an ordinary Frankish or English household and entered the Viking economy that received it, because that economy operated, for most of this story's span, not on minted coinage carrying a fixed and trusted value the way a modern currency does, but on what economic historians call a bullion economy, in which silver's worth was measured, quite literally, by its weight, and Viking Age hoards recovered by archaeologists across Scandinavia, the Danelaw, and the eastern river routes alike consistently contain, alongside intact coins from a dozen different mints and a dozen different kingdoms, a considerable quantity of what specialists call hack silver, jewellery, ingots, and coins alike deliberately cut, chopped, or bent into smaller fragments by their Viking owners, and small folding sets of weighing scales, portable enough to carry on campaign, that a trader or a raider would use to weigh out a payment fragment by fragment until the scale balanced against a set of standardized weights. A system that meant a beautifully crafted piece of Frankish or English church silver, the very altar vessels and jewelled book covers. This story described being stripped from Lindisfarne's own altars at its very beginning, held to the men who took it, no value whatsoever as an object of craftsmanship or of sacred meaning, only as so many ounces of pure, anonymous, endlessly divisible metal, a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures, in a single practical habit, the entire gap in worldview that made a monastery's treasury so devastatingly easy a target in the first place, an object one culture prized as sacred and irreplaceable, A second culture experienced as nothing more than raw material, waiting only for a knife and a set of scales to become something else entirely. The single largest such hoard ever recovered anywhere in Britain, buried on the banks of the River Ribble in Lancashire, and discovered entirely by accident by workmen repairing the riverbank in 1840, contained, when archaeologists finally finished cataloguing it, more than 8,500 individual items, coins minted from Baghdad to Rome, sitting alongside chopped brooches, ingots and arm rings. A single buried fortune large enough that modern historians still debate exactly which Viking leader or army might have owned it, and why it was ever buried and never reclaimed. A question the silver itself, sitting silent in a museum case today, will never answer, since whoever buried it clearly intended to return, and, for reasons this story has no way of recovering, simply never did. We can look too at the pattern the Irish monastic annals record year after year, of raided and re-raided religious houses. Entries that read, in their brevity, almost clinically, a monastery burned, its community scattered or slain, and then, a few years later, the same monastery's name appearing again in the same annal for the same reason. Evidence of communities that tried, generation after generation, to rebuild on the same vulnerable ground, because it was the only ground they had, absorbing loss after loss with a grim persistence that the chroniclers rarely pause to admire, because to them it was not persistence at all, but simply the unavoidable, exhausting rhythm of ordinary life along a coast the ships kept coming back to. We can look too at the enslaved, whose numbers across the whole of this period very likely dwarfed, many times over, the number of raiders who ever carried a sword ashore, since a single successful raid on an undefended village or monastery could yield, in captives alone, a return far exceeding whatever silver or church plate happened to be sitting in reach. And it is worth naming honestly that the archaeological and documentary record of this enormous trade in human beings is thinner, by a considerable margin, than the record of the raids that produced the captives in the first place. Because an enslaved person, unlike a bishop or a king, rarely left behind a letter, a chronicle entry, or even, in most cases, a marked grave, their existence surviving for us today mostly in the second-hand incidental mentions of the people who bought, sold, and owned them, in the rare and precious eyewitness account of an outsider like Ibn Fadlan, and in the increasingly sophisticated genetic and isotopic analysis of skeletal remains that modern archaeology has only in the last few decades begun to use to recover something of these individual, otherwise voiceless lives, reading from the chemical signature of a single set of teeth, where in Europe a particular enslaved person had actually grown up before the ship or the raid or the market carried them somewhere else entirely. It's worth naming as well the voices we do have, because they are rarer and more precious for exactly the reason we have just described, and one of the most striking survives not from a monk or a king, but from an English clergyman named Wulfstan, Archbishop of York, who delivered a sermon in the year 1014, at the very height of a fresh and devastating renewal of Viking attacks on England under a Danish king. We will meet properly in a few moments, a sermon he titled, in Old English, The Sermon of the Wolf to the English, in which Wulfstan catalogues, in a tone of raw, furious, and unmistakably genuine anguish, rather than the more distanced chronicle-style reporting we have relied on for most of this story, the collapse of ordinary social bonds and ordinary decency under the pressure of repeated invasion. Describing a kingdom where a father sells his own son into slavery to survive, where kinsmen betray kinsmen out of fear or desperation, and where the whole fabric of a Christian society, in Wulfstan's own furious telling, appears to be tearing itself apart from the strain of enduring wave after wave of the very violence this whole story has spent hours describing from the outside. It is worth letting Wulfstan's voice stand for a moment as a kind of correction to everything else in this story told from the comfortable distance of centuries, because it is one of the very few surviving documents that lets us hear something close to the actual, immediate, unprocessed panic of a society that did not yet know, as we do, sitting safely on the other side of history, how this particular story was eventually going to end. How we actually know any of this. It is worth pausing too before we press on toward the final chapters of this story, to be honest with you about where all of this information actually comes from, because the sources this whole account rests on are neither neutral nor complete, and a story that pretends otherwise is not dealing honestly with you. The single largest body of written evidence for the raids themselves comes from the chronicles kept inside the very societies being raided. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in England, the Irish monastic annals, the various Frankish annals kept at royal monasteries across the Carolingian world, and every one of these sources was written by Christian clergy, for Christian audiences, describing pagan attackers, which means that from the very first surviving sentence describing a Viking raid, we are reading an account produced by the victim's own side, shaped by their own religious framework, their own political interests, and their own understandable inclination to cast their attackers in the darkest possible light, an inclination worth remembering every single time this story has quoted a chronicler's description of Viking savagery, since we have almost no equivalent surviving Scandinavian written account, composed at the actual time of the raids to weigh against it. That absence is not an accident of survival, but a reflection of a deeper fact about Viking Age Scandinavian society itself. It was, through the great majority of the period this story covers, a culture that transmitted its laws, its poetry and its history orally, rather than in writing using, where it did write anything down at all, a runic alphabet suited to short formulaic inscriptions on stone and wood, rather than to sustained historical narrative, which means that nearly everything we have from the Norse side of this story describing events and beliefs in any real narrative depth, the Icelandic sagas, the prose Edda compiled by the Icelandic chieftain and scholar Snorri Sturluson, the primary chronicle of Kiev, was written down 2, 3, sometimes 4 centuries after the events it claims to describe by Christian, literate authors working from oral tradition that had already passed through many generations of retelling, reshaping, and, in more than a few documented cases, deliberate literary embellishment, which is precisely why this story has, again and again tonight, flagged specific details: the blood eagle, Ragnar's precise historical existence, the exact wording of a battlefield speech, as uncertain rather than repeating them as settled fact, because the honest answer, for a great deal of what popular culture treats as established Viking history, is that we simply cannot be fully certain where the remembered historical kernel ends and the storyteller's embellishment begins. What has changed this picture more than anything else in the last half-century, and what has allowed modern historians to write a genuinely more balanced and more complete account of this period than earlier generations? Working mostly from these same biased chronicles ever could is archaeology, an evidence base that does not care what any chronicler wanted you to believe. The ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad, the settlement at Lans O Meadows, the trading town excavated beneath the streets of modern York, the tens of thousands of Arab silver dirhams recovered from Scandinavian hoards, the skeletal and genetic evidence recovered from burial sites across Scandinavia, Britain, Iceland, and the Eastern River routes, all of it lets modern historians check the chronicler's claims against physical, datable, ideologically indifferent evidence. And it is that cross-checking, patient and unglamorous as it is, that has produced nearly every one of the correctives this story has offered tonight, from the horned helmet that never existed to the genuinely sophisticated trading economy that the old, purely raid-focused telling of this history used to leave almost entirely out of the picture. Even the excavated dirt of an English county can be made to testify in this particular investigation, because the place name evidence this story has already leaned on more than once tonight the density of Old Norse by and Thorpe endings scattered across a modern map of eastern England was itself gathered systematically and county by county by generations of philologists and local historians working, in effect, a separate and entirely independent line of evidence from either the biased chronicles or the archaeologist's spade, and the fact that this linguistic map, built from place names alone, lines up so closely with the boundaries the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself describes for the Danelaw is exactly the kind of independent, mutually reinforcing confirmation across entirely different categories of evidence that gives modern historians real confidence in a period this otherwise starved of contemporary written testimony. A story told honestly about a period this thinly and this unevenly documented has to hold its own conclusions a little more loosely than a story about, say, a 19th century emperor whose every movement was recorded in newspapers and official bulletins, and it is worth naming that difference plainly one more time before we return to the last kings and the last battles this long night still has left to tell you about. The man behind the legend. We have now mentioned the name Ragnar 3 separate times in this story, at the siege of Paris, in the shadow of his supposed sons leading the great heathen army into England, and in passing reference to a Mediterranean raid led by men later tradition calls his sons, and it is worth pausing now to do properly what we have only gestured towards so far, which is to ask directly and honestly who Ragnar Lothbrok actually was, because the honest answer is considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than either the swaggering television drama version of the man or a simple dismissal of him as pure invention. No contemporary 9th century source, written at the actual time these events took place, mentions anyone named Ragnar in connection with the 845 raid on Paris at all. That identification comes entirely from later Norse saga tradition, composed centuries afterward, which means that the historical figure who actually led that raid, whoever he was, has come down to us stripped of his real name and dressed instead in the identity of a considerably more famous legendary figure, a pattern of retrospective attribution, folding an earlier and now forgotten historical actor into a single, more memorable legendary hero that appears again and again across oral traditions the world over, and that historians have a real technical name for: heroic accretion, the tendency of a culture's collective memory to gather the deeds of many separate, lesser-remembered men onto the shoulders of one single, larger-than-life figure whose name survives precisely because it became the vessel for everyone else's forgotten story. The Ragnar of the sagas, as those sagas eventually came to tell it, was a Danish king of extraordinary and entirely legendary accomplishment, married across the course of his saga life to a sequence of wives that includes, in one particularly vivid strand of the tradition, a shield-maiden warrior queen named Lagertha, credited with fighting alongside him in a battle, a figure whose own historicity scholars regard with real skepticism, since she appears only in a single, quite late and quite literary Latin history, compiled by a Danish writer named Saxo Grammaticus, around the year 1200, working from oral material that had by that point had 3.5 centuries to accumulate exactly the kind of embellishment we have already discussed. Ragnar's saga death too has become one of the most famous single images associated with this entire period of history, captured, according to the tradition, by an English king named Ella of Northumbria, and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes to die, reciting, as the poison took hold, a final defiant death song boasting of his own past glories and looking forward, without fear, to feasting in Valhalla, an image of extraordinary narrative power that has shaped popular imagination of Viking death and Viking fatalism for centuries since, and that rests, so far as any contemporary historical record can verify, on no firmer historical foundation than the saga's own storytelling instincts, since no 9th century source records any such execution, or indeed any king named Ella executing anyone in this particular manner at all. What does appear to be genuinely solidly historical, and this is worth naming plainly because it shows us something true and something important sitting directly underneath the legend, is that the great heathen army which conquered Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia in the 860s and 870s really was led, at least in significant part, by a group of brothers, including a commander the sources do consistently call Ivar, whom later tradition folded into Ragnar's legendary family, and that this Ivar's campaign in Northumbria really did include, according to a broadly credible near contemporary tradition, the killing of a Northumbrian king named Ella, whose death these brothers are recorded by multiple independent later sources as having specifically sought out and avenged in a manner strongly suggestive that some real historical grievance, quite possibly connected to the death of these brothers' own actual historical father at English hands, sat underneath everything the later, more fantastical snake pit legend eventually grew up around. Which is to say, Ragnar Lothbrok, exactly the man of pure legend, almost certainly never existed in the specific singular form the sagas describe, but a real 9th century Scandinavian leader or leaders whose actual name or name's history has simply failed to preserve for us, quite plausibly did lead a real raid on Paris. Quite plausibly did father real sons who led a real conquering army into England, and quite plausibly did die in some real and now unrecoverable way at English hands, a death his sons genuinely avenged, and the legend that grew up around that lost, real man across the following 4 centuries tells us, in its own way, just as much about what later Norse and English audiences needed their history to mean as it tells us about the 9th century itself. A duke from the fjords. If Ragnar shows us how thoroughly legend can grow over a real historical kernel, the story of a chieftain named Rollo shows us, with far more documentary confidence, exactly how the tide we have been tracking all night could, in the right circumstances, simply stop retreating and settle permanently into new ground. Rollo, whose own origins later Norman and Norse tradition dispute, some sources placing him as Norwegian, others as Danish, led a Viking force that had, by the early 10th century, established itself with real and growing permanence along the lower reaches of the Seine, the very river Ragnar's raiders had ascended to besiege Paris some 7 decades earlier, a persistent occupation that the reigning king of West Francia, Charles the Simple, found himself by the year 911 no more able to dislodge by force than any of his royal predecessors had managed to dislodge any other entrenched Viking force anywhere else in this story, and Charles reached in that year for a solution that this story has not yet seen, tried quite this deliberately. Rather than pay Rollo to leave, as Charles the Bald had paid an earlier generation of raiders at Paris in 845, Charles the Simple offered Rollo something considerably more permanent, formal legal title, as a vassal of the French crown, to the very territory his forces already occupied, in exchange for Rollo's baptism as a Christian, his nominal submission to the French king's overlordship, and, crucially, his promise to defend that same stretch of coastline against any future Viking, raiders who might otherwise be tempted to repeat exactly what Rollo himself had just successfully done. It was in effect an agreement to fight fire with fire, and it worked, in the narrow practical sense that mattered most to Charles, considerably better than anyone at the time could have confidently predicted, because the territory granted to Rollo, which took its name directly from the people who now ruled it, the Northmen becoming, across the following generations, the Duchy of Normandy, did indeed prove to be an effective barrier against further Viking incursion up the Seine, its Norse settlers and their descendants converting to Christianity, adopting the French language, and intermarrying with the existing Frankish population with a speed and a thoroughness that, within only a few generations, had transformed Rollo's Viking warband into a fully French-speaking, fully Christian, feudal aristocracy that had, on the surface at least, largely lost the outward markers of its Scandinavian origin, retaining from that origin chiefly a reputation for exceptional martial vigour, and a genuinely striking talent for aggressive territorial expansion that this new Norman nobility would go on to display with world historical consequences in nearly every direction available to it across the following 2 centuries, conquering, among a great deal else, the Kingdom of Sicily and southern Italy from its Byzantine and Muslim rulers, launching some of the most consequential expeditions of the entire era of the Crusades, and, in the single most consequential conquest of all, one this story is going to walk you through directly in just a little while, crossing the English Channel in the year 1066 under a Duke of Normandy named William, a direct descendant 5 generations removed of Rollo the Viking chieftain, to conquer England itself, a king of 3 crowns. It is worth naming, before we reach that final resonant conquest, one more figure whose career represents more completely than any other single life in this entire story the full and startling scale of political power that a Scandinavian ruler could accumulate at the very height of the Viking Age's political maturity. A Danish prince named Knut, remembered to history as Knut the Great, who inherited, through a combination of conquest, careful marriage alliance, and considerable political skill, not merely a single kingdom but 3 ruling at the height of his power in the 1020s and 1030s, over Denmark, Norway, and most remarkably of all England and itself. A kingdom his own father, Sweyn Forkbeard, had first conquered outright in 1013, driving the reigning English king, Ethelred the Unready, briefly into exile before Knut, following his father's sudden death, secured the English throne for himself through a hard-fought campaign against Ethelred's own son and eventual successor Edmund Ironside, a campaign that ended in 1016, not in Edmund's total defeat, but in a formal division of England between the 2 rivals, a division that became, upon Edmund's death only weeks later, under circumstances contemporary chroniclers describe with a suspicion they never quite managed to substantiate full and undisputed rule of the entire English kingdom for Knut alone. What makes Knut worth dwelling on, beyond the sheer scale of his North Sea empire, is how thoroughly and how deliberately he ruled England, not as a foreign occupier extracting tribute in the manner of the raiders who had terrorised the kingdom for the previous 2 centuries, but as a genuinely English king, retaining much of the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative and legal structure that Alfred's own descendants had spent generations building, marrying Ethelred's own widow, Emma of Normandy, in a match that deliberately bound the new Danish royal line to the Old English one, issuing law codes that presented themselves explicitly as continuations of established English legal tradition rather than impositions of foreign Danish custom, and even, according to a famous and probably at least partly apocryphal story recorded by a monastic chronicler writing a century after Knut's death, staging a deliberate public demonstration of his own limits as a mortal king, commanding the incoming tide on an English beach to halt before his throne, and then, when the water rose to soak his feet regardless, turning to his flattering courtiers to declare that let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name but God alone, whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws, a story almost certainly more useful as later moral fable than as reliable reportage of Knut's actual words, but one that captures, however invented, something genuinely true about the kind of legitimacy this particular Viking-descended king was working so deliberately to project, that of a wise and pious Christian monarch rather than a foreign conqueror, and it is worth letting that image of Knut and the tide sit for a moment against the governing image this whole story has already asked you to hold in mind, because here, near the very peak of Scandinavian political power in Western Europe, was a Viking king himself publicly acknowledging, whether the anecdote is strictly true or not, that even the greatest ruler this story has yet produced could not command the tide to do anything but exactly what it was always going to do regardless. It is worth naming too the more concrete administrative innovations Knut brought with him from his Scandinavian inheritance, and grafted onto the English system he otherwise preserved so carefully, because they show us a ruler thinking, quite deliberately, about how to hold together a genuinely new kind of state, a North Sea empire spanning 3 separate kingdoms, with no shared language of daily administration and no earlier precedent anywhere in this story for governing all 3 at once. He maintained at the core of his own personal military strength a standing core of elite household troops called housecarls, professional, well-equipped and directly loyal to the king's own person rather than to any regional earl, a force that gave Knut, and would later give his English successors, a reliable core of trained soldiers considerably more dependable than the traditional Anglo-Saxon levy of part-time farmer soldiers this story has already watched assembled and disbanded season after season throughout Alfred's own wars a century before. He divided England, for administrative convenience, into a small number of great earldoms, delegating real regional authority to trusted magnates, English and Danish alike, including, most consequentially for the rest of the English history, an ambitious English earl named Godwin, whose own family Knut's patronage helped raise to a prominence that would, within a single generation, produce the very Harold Godwinson, whose contested claim to the English throne would open the fateful year of 1066 this story is about to walk you through. And he funded his own government, and the standing fleet he kept ready to defend his North Sea holdings through a nationwide land tax the English called herregeld, army money, a direct administrative descendant, however uncomfortable the lineage, of the very danegeld that earlier English kings had once raised in humiliating emergency payments to buy off Knut's own raiding predecessors, now collected instead as a routine, permanent feature of ordinary government, one more small but telling instance of this whole story's recurring pattern, an institution born from a kingdom's desperate need to survive, Viking violence quietly outliving the violence itself, and becoming in time simply part of how that kingdom was ordinarily run. The gods give way to the cross. Knut's own deliberate performance of Christian piety points us toward one of the single most important and single most underappreciated forces working across this entire period to bring the age of Viking raiding to its eventual close, a force considerably quieter than any battle this story has described so far, but, in the long run, considerably more decisive: the steady, uneven, but ultimately irreversible conversion of Scandinavia itself to Christianity. That conversion did not happen in a single dramatic moment, but across roughly 2 centuries of missionary effort, political calculation, and in more than a few cases, outright coercion, as successive Scandinavian kings, recognizing that Christian conversion offered access to the diplomatic, dynastic, and administrative networks of the wider Christian European world, that a stubbornly pagan kingdom would remain permanently locked out of, embraced the new religion themselves and, having done so, set about imposing it, often forcibly, on their own still largely pagan subjects. Denmark's King Harald Bluetooth, whose own name, by an accident of 20th century engineering history worth pausing on for its sheer improbability, was borrowed 9 centuries later by Scandinavian technology companies for a short-range wireless communication standard now used by billions of devices worldwide, a genuinely strange kind of immortality for a medieval Danish king to have stumbled into, raised, around the year 965, a great carved runestone at Jelling in Denmark proclaiming his own conversion and boasting, in an inscription that survives intact to this day, of having made the Danes Christian, a claim that considerably overstated how completed that process actually was at the time, but that marks, nonetheless, a genuine and consequential royal turning point. That same runestone still stands today, one of 2 raised at Jelling, the smaller and earlier one set up by Harold's own father, King Gorm the Old, in memory of his wife, and the larger one Harold himself raised beside it, carved on 3 faces with a memorial inscription to his own parents, an image of a great entwined beast in the old pagan interlace style this story has already described. And, on its 3rd and most consequential face, one of the earliest surviving depictions of Christ anywhere in Scandinavian art, bounded and haloed in the same dense, coiling, ornamental style as the beast on the stone beside it. A single object that captures, more economically than almost anything else, this story could point to. The exact moment of transition this section is describing. The old artistic language and the new religion carved side by side on the very same rock, commissioned by a king, determined that both audiences, the community still comfortable with the beast and the community he needed to persuade toward the cross, would recognise something familiar looking back at them. Norway's conversion proved bloodier and more contested, driven forward by a sequence of warrior kings, chief among them Olaf Tryggvason in the 990s, and, a generation later, Olaf Haraldsson, both of whom combined genuine missionary conviction with a considerable willingness to destroy pagan temples, execute or exile resistant chieftains, and compel baptism at the point of a sword, methods that cost Olaf Haraldsson his own life in 1030, killed in battle by a coalition of Norwegian nobles resentful of his heavy-handed rule, only for the same Olaf to be venerated, within a remarkably short time afterward, as a Christian martyr and saint, St. Olaf, whose cult became one of the single most important unifying religious symbols in the whole of medieval Scandinavia. A transformation from resented tyrant to beloved saint that echoes, in its own way, the earlier transformation we already discussed of the murdered East Anglian King Edmund from defeated ruler into venerated martyr, a pattern worth naming as one more thread this story keeps circling back to. Violent death. In this particular corner of medieval Christian memory, had an almost reliable tendency to be reshaped, within a generation, into sanctified sacrifice. Sweden's conversion came slower and more unevenly still, with the old pagan religious centre at Uppsala, a site of major periodic sacrificial gatherings described, in a vivid and possibly somewhat sensationalised account, by the German chronicler Adam of Bremen writing around 1070, persisting as an active centre of the old faith well into the 11th century, even as Christianity had already become firmly established across most of the rest of Scandinavia. The consequences of this conversion for the raiding culture this whole story has followed were profound, even though they unfolded gradually, rather than as any single decisive turning point. A Christianized Scandinavia was a Scandinavia increasingly bound into the same church-based, oath-based diplomatic and legal order that had always constrained, however imperfectly, the internal warfare of Christian Francia and Christian England, a Scandinavia whose kings now had genuine religious as well as political reasons to prefer negotiated marriage alliances and formal treaties with their fellow Christian monarchs over indiscriminate raiding against fellow Christians, and whose raiders themselves, increasingly raised within a Christian moral framework that had never applied to their pagan ancestors, lost, across these same generations, both the religious sanction and the outsider's moral distance that had once made an attack on a Christian monastery feel, to the raiders themselves, like an act without any particular spiritual cost attached to it. It is worth naming too that the Christianization of Scandinavia coincided with the same broader European trend toward more organized, more centrally governed, and better defended kingdoms that we have already watched play out in Alfred's Wessex. Kingdoms increasingly capable of fielding standing coastal defences, fortified towns, and organised fleets of their own, closing off region by region exactly the kind of undefended, target-rich opportunity that had made the earliest raids of the 9th century so devastatingly easy to carry out in the first place. The tide, in other words, did not turn because the raiders lost their ships or their courage. It turned because the coastline itself had, across 3 centuries, gradually built the seawalls that had simply not existed when Lindisfarne's monks first heard the sound of unfamiliar keels grinding onto their beach. The last great wave, and yet the tide, even in its final ebbing, had one last and genuinely spectacular surge left in it, and it arrived fittingly for a story that has spent so much of its time in England, on English soil, in the single most consequential year in the whole of English medieval history, 1066. That year opened with the death in January of the childless English King Edward the Confessor, setting off a 3-way succession crisis among rival claimants to the English throne, each with his own claim of varying legal and dynastic strength. Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl whom the dying Edward had, according to English tradition, named as his chosen successor, and who was duly crowned king within days of Edward's death. Duke William of Normandy, that same direct descendant of Rollo we met a little while ago, who claimed that Edward, his own distant cousin through Edward's Norman mother, had previously promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had, on an earlier visit to Normandy, sworn a binding oath to support William's own claim, and, arriving from an entirely different and considerably more directly Scandinavian direction, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, a genuinely extraordinary figure in his own right whose earlier career, before ever setting eyes on England, had already carried him into exile as a young man, into mercenary service in the Byzantine Varangian Guard we discussed earlier tonight, where he fought campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean and reputedly amassed a legendary personal fortune, and eventually back to Norway to claim and hold its throne through years of hard campaigning, a life story so packed with adventure that later Norse tradition remembered him simply as Hardrada, the hard ruler, and who now advanced his own claim to England on the strength of an old agreement of debated authenticity made decades earlier between a previous Norwegian king and a previous English one. It is worth pausing before this story carries Harald Hardrada to the battlefield where he would finally die, to walk through just how extraordinary that earlier career genuinely was, because it ties together, in the life of a single man, nearly every thread this whole long night has already followed. Driven into exile from Norway as a teenager after his own half-brother, King Olaf Haraldsson, the same Olaf who would soon be venerated as Saint Olaf, was killed in the very battle that first drove Harold from his homeland. The young exile made his way east along the same river road to Miklagard. This story has already travelled once tonight, serving first at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, the Rus ruler of Kiev, whose own daughter Harold would, years later, return to marry before continuing on to Constantinople itself, where he took service in the emperor's own Varangian Guard and rose, across roughly a decade of campaigning, to a position of real command, fighting the Byzantine Empire's wars against Arab forces in Sicily and against rebels and enemies across Asia Minor and the Balkans, campaigns that later Norse saga tradition, always eager to embellish an already remarkable career, credits him with fighting in no fewer than 18 major battles, and that appear on the more careful modern reading of both Norse and Byzantine sources to have made him genuinely wealthy enough by the time political intrigue at the Byzantine court eventually turned against him, and he made his own dramatic escape from Constantinople back north toward Kiev and, eventually, home to Norway to fund the military campaign that would, in time, win him the Norwegian throne itself. A man who had fought under the walls of Constantinople, married a Kievan princess, and commanded the very same elite guard this story has already described protecting Byzantine emperors, spending his final years and finally meeting his death on a muddy riverbank in the north of England, is as complete a single human summary of this whole night's sprawling geography, from the fjords of Norway to the Golden Horn and back again, as this story is ever going to offer you. Harold Hardrada struck first, sailing to England that September with a large fleet and in alliance with Harold Godwinson's own estranged and resentful brother Tostig, who had been stripped of his English earldom the year before and had every personal reason to want to see his brother's new kingship fail, landed in the north of England and won a hard-fought victory over the local defending forces outside York. Harold Godwinson, informed of the invasion while still in the south of England, watching anxiously for the entirely separate and, as it happened, still delayed invasion he expected from Duke William across the Channel, force-marched his own army north with a speed genuinely remarkable for the age, covering something in the range of 200 miles in only a handful of days, and caught Harold Hardrada's Norwegian force by surprise at a place called Stamford Bridge, a few miles east of York, on the 25th of September 1006 in a battle whose most famous single episode, whatever precise embellishment later English chroniclers may have added to it, describes a single enormous Norwegian warrior single-handedly holding the narrow bridge itself against the entire advancing English army for a remarkable stretch of time before finally being killed, buying his retreating countrymen precious minutes to form a defensive line on the far bank, a defensive line that, in the end, was not enough. Harold Hardrada himself was killed in the fighting that followed, struck, according to the tradition, by an arrow through the throat, and his invading army was all but annihilated, so thoroughly that the Norwegian fleet, which had arrived that summer requiring some 300 ships to carry its invasion force, is said to have needed only a small remaining fraction of that number to carry the shattered survivors home. It is worth pausing on Stamford Bridge for a moment, because a great many serious historians of this period regard it, and not any later or more famous battle, as the true and proper closing bookend of the entire Viking Age, the last time a genuinely major Scandinavian royal army, sailing under a Scandinavian king, in the old raiding and conquering tradition this whole story has followed since Lindisfarne, attempted a full-scale invasion of another European kingdom, and it is worth sitting to with the particular cruelty of the timing, because Harold Godwinson's exhausted, victorious army had barely 3 weeks to rest and reorganise itself in the north of England before the news arrived that Duke William's long-delayed Norman fleet had finally crossed the Channel and landed, unopposed, on the southern coast of England, while Harold's attention and his army had both been fixed on the entirely different threat from Norway. Harold marched his weary force south again at the same exhausting pace, and met William's Norman army at Hastings on the 14th of October 1006, in a battle that has become, in the centuries since, one of the single most famous military engagements in all of European history. A long, grinding day of fighting in which William's combined force of Norman cavalry, infantry and archers gradually wore down Harold's exhausted and depleted shield wall, till Harold himself was killed in the battle's final hours, struck, according to the most famous and most disputed single detail in the whole engagement, by an arrow through the eye, an image immortalised in the Bayeux tapestry, a remarkable embroidered narrative chronicle of the entire campaign, commissioned within a few years of the battle itself, and still, astonishingly, largely intact and viewable today, though modern art historians caution, in keeping with this story's own recurring insistence on honest uncertainty, that the exact identification of which embroidered figure actually represents Harold's death, and by precisely what wound, remains genuinely disputed even now. And it is worth letting the full shape of that single autumn sit with you for a moment before this story moves on, because it captures something this whole long night has been quietly building toward from its very first paragraph. Within the space of barely 3 weeks in the year 1006, the crown of England was fought over by an English king, a king of Norway descended from the very raiding tradition that had terrorised this same island for 2.5 centuries, and a Duke of Normandy who was himself, 5 generations back, the direct descendant of a Viking chieftain named Rollo, which means that whichever of the two Scandinavian descended claimants ultimately prevailed at Hastings, and it was, in the end, William. The Viking tide, in some real and genealogical sense, was always going to finish the story of 1066 by claiming the English throne one final time, whether it arrived that particular autumn, wearing a Norwegian king's crown or a Norman duke's coronet. William's conquest that followed, the last successful invasion of England in the whole of its history down to the present day, is conventionally remembered, and rightly so, as a Norman conquest, a French-speaking, feudal, thoroughly continental transformation of English law, language, and landholding, and it is a genuinely strange and genuinely fitting irony worth sitting with for one last moment before we turn toward this story's final reflections, that the very last great conquest this whole account of Viking terror has to describe was carried out not by men still sailing under the old gods and the old raiding tradition at all, but by the thoroughly Christianized, thoroughly French-speaking descendants of Vikings who had a century and a half earlier made exactly the same bargain Cnut's own line had made, trading the Sea Raider's sword for a settled crown, and coming back in the end to finish what their own great-great-great-grandfather had first begun on the banks of the Seine. What the tide left behind. A tide, we said at the very beginning of this story, does not vanish without a trace once it withdraws. It leaves the shoreline changed permanently in ways that remain long after the water itself has gone, and it is worth spending real time now before this story turns toward its final reflections, cataloguing exactly what the Viking tide left behind on the shores of the lands it had touched, because the honest answer is that it left behind considerably more than burned monasteries and grim entries in a monk's annal. We have already named a good portion of this inheritance in passing across tonight's story, but it deserves to be gathered here, deliberately into one place. It left behind cities: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick in Ireland, all founded as Viking trading camps. York in England, whose very name derives from the Old Norse Jorvik, itself an adaptation of the earlier Anglo-Saxon name, and which served for the better part of a century as the capital of an independent Viking kingdom in its own right. Kiev and Novgorod in the east, cradle cities of an entire subsequent civilization. Normandy's own great ducal and later royal seat of Rouen. It left behind language, an inheritance so deep that, as we noted earlier tonight, it lives inside the most basic grammatical scaffolding of modern English. In pronouns used in nearly every sentence any English speaker constructs, and in an enormous vocabulary of everyday nouns and verbs: sky and window, knife and skull, they and their law and outlaw, husband and ransack, words so thoroughly naturalised into English that no ordinary speaker today experiences them as foreign borrowings at all, and it left behind, across the whole of eastern England, a landscape still dense with place names ending in the Old Norse suffixes by and thorpe and thwaite, a linguistic map of Scandinavian settlement that a careful eye can still trace county by county across a modern English road atlas 11 centuries later. It left behind law, in ways considerably more foundational to the modern English-speaking legal tradition than popular memory generally credits, since a number of legal historians trace the deep roots of one of English common law's most distinctive institutions, trial by a jury of one's peers, at least in part to the assembly-based community judgment legal culture the Danelaw settlers brought with them into eastern England, layered onto and blended with existing Anglo-Saxon legal custom, in ways that later medieval English kings would build upon, and formalise into the jury system that English law, and through it the law of the United States and every other nation whose legal tradition descends from English common law, still relies on today, a genuinely striking thread to trace, if it holds up under the scrutiny legal historians continue to give it, from a scattering of free Danish and Norwegian farmers gathering to render judgment on a disputed cattle theft in 9th century Lincolnshire, all the way to a modern jury box in a courtroom on the other side of the planet. It left behind too a considerably darker and more recent legacy worth naming honestly rather than passing over, because the same imagery this story spent real time correcting earlier tonight, the horned helmet, the berserk warrior, the imagined purity of a Nordic racial past, was seized upon, in the late 19th and especially the early 20th century, by nationalist and eventually explicitly fascist political movements across Northern Europe, most catastrophically by the Nazi regime in Germany, which appropriated Norse mythology and imagery of the Viking warrior into a manufactured, deeply distorted ideology of Aryan racial supremacy that the actual ethnically and culturally connected but far from racially exclusive trading and raiding world. This story has spent all night describing would have found utterly unrecognisable, a genuinely toxic historical afterlife that modern historians of the Viking Age still find themselves actively working to correct and to disentangle their subject from, and it is worth naming that correction as one more reason, alongside simple historical accuracy, that a story told honestly about the Vikings owes its listeners the fuller, more complicated picture this whole night has tried to paint, rather than the simpler, more mythic one that proved, in the 20th century's darkest chapter, so dangerously easy for other men to weaponize for purposes these 9th century farmers and traders and raiders could never have imagined and never would have recognized as their own. And it left behind, finally, something considerably more intimate and considerably more present than any of that. Something that reaches, quite possibly, into the very room you are lying in right now as you listen to this. Modern genetic studies, drawing on the enormous datasets generated by consumer ancestry testing companies over the last 2 decades, have confirmed what place names and legal history had already suggested, that a meaningful proportion of people across the British Isles, particularly in regions once part of the Danelaw, or once under direct Norse settlement in places like Orkney, Shetland, and the northwest of England, carry detectable Scandinavian ancestry passed down generation after generation from Viking Age settlers who came, as this story has shown you again and again tonight, not only to raid but to farm, to marry, and to stay. And the same is true in different proportions and different patterns, across Ireland, across Normandy and the rest of northern France, and across the whole of the Eastern European lands the Russ once settled and traded through. It is a strange thing to sit with, in the quiet and the dark that the Terra Alcuin wrote about in a shaking letter to a grieving bishop 13 centuries ago has resolved itself, for a great many listeners hearing this story tonight, into nothing more frightening than a line item on a genetic ancestry report. A small, unremarkable percentage of Scandinavian DNA sitting quietly alongside all the other inherited fragments of a family's much longer and much more tangled story. The fury of the Northmen reduced, across 11 or 12 centuries, from a plea in a church's own daily liturgy to a footnote in a birthday gift ancestry kit. If you ever find yourself standing in front of the actual physical remains of this story, and it is worth naming gently exactly where a listener might do that, since this whole channel has always believed that history feels a little more real. Once you know it is not confined to a book or a screen, but sitting right now in a specific building you could actually walk into, the experience is a genuinely strange and genuinely moving one. In Oslo, a museum built specifically to house them shelters the excavated ships from Oseberg and Gokstad, and a third site called Tunøy, hulls of oak that a Viking Age shipwright's own hands shaped more than 11 centuries ago, preserved by nothing more than the accident of Norwegian burial clay, and now standing restored and largely intact, under a roof built around them because no other building in the world could safely hold anything quite like them. And visitors who walk the narrow gallery around the Oseberg ship's own hull report, again and again, the same slightly disorienting sensation that a vessel this graceful, this obviously seaworthy, and this obviously ancient does not look at first glance like something that could possibly have terrified an entire continent, until you notice, along its full length, exactly how narrow, how light, and how fast a ship built for open water and shallow rivers alike would actually have needed to be. In the Swedish countryside and across Denmark and Norway alongside it, several thousand carved runestones still stand where medieval families first raised them. Weathered granite markers bearing short, formulaic inscriptions. So-and-so raised this stone in memory of his father, who died in the East or who died in England, or in one particularly well-known and well-preserved example carved into a rock face at Ramsund in Sweden, an elaborate picture stone depicting, in carved images rather than words alone, the legendary hero Sigurd slaying a dragon, a visual retelling of a story that the Norse themselves would have recognised as clearly as a modern audience recognises a familiar film, evidence that this culture's storytelling instincts reached, in the end, into stone as readily as into spoken verse. And it is worth naming finally that this whole subject has never actually gone quiet in the centuries since the last Viking ship was ever launched in earnest, because the same imagery this story spent real-time correcting and complicating tonight, the ships, the raids, the gods, the sagas, has been retold, reenacted, and reimagined by every subsequent generation according to its own particular needs, from the 19th century Romantic revival that gave us, alongside its genuinely valuable scholarly recovery of Old Norse literature, the horned helmet this story already debunked, to the modern reenactment societies that gather today, in Denmark and Norway, and a great many other countries besides. To hand-forge their own reproduction weapons and hand-sew their own reproduction sailcloth, and row their own faithfully reconstructed longships out onto open water, chasing in their own careful, historically minded way, some small taste of the exact same mastery of wind and tide this story has spent so many hours describing. It is worth naming too that the story continues to be told in film, in television, and in fiction, in forms that range from the carefully researched to the wildly embellished, in exactly the same spectrum of accuracy and invention that this story has shown you the sagas themselves occupied when they were first written down 8 or 9 centuries ago, which means that the process this whole night has walked you through, a real historical kernel gradually gathering legend, embellishment, and meaning around itself as each new generation retells it according to its own needs, is not something that happened only in the deep, distant past and then simply stopped. It is still happening tonight, in the very act of this channel retelling it to you, and it will very likely still be happening in some new form none of us can fully predict, another 1,000 years from now. Why they were feared said plainly. Why they were feared said plainly. We have spent this whole long night gathering pieces of an answer to the question this video opened with, and it is worth, now, laying that answer out plainly and completely all in one place before we turn toward this story's final reflections, because a question this large deserves a direct answer rather than one scattered, however carefully, across 300 years of narrative. The Vikings were feared, first because of a genuine and unmatched technological advantage, a shipbuilding tradition, refined across centuries before Lindisfarne ever burned, that gave Scandinavian raiders a speed, a range, and above all an unpredictability across open water and up undefended rivers that no other power in contemporary Europe could match or reliably anticipate, turning the entire coastline and river network of Christian Europe into a single continuous, permeable frontier with no safe interior at all. They were feared second because of the specific and deliberately calculated psychology of their earliest and most memorable attacks, strikes against sacred, wealthy and totally undefended religious houses that violated a boundary Christian society had never imagined needed defending, a violation whose shock, recorded in Alcuin's own trembling words, set the emotional tone for the entire 3 centuries of dread that followed, even as the actual character of Viking activity grew across those same centuries, steadily more varied, more commercial and more settled. They were feared third because the Christian kingdoms they struck were, again and again, too politically fragmented, too internally distracted by their own dynastic quarrels and civil wars to mount the kind of unified, sustained coastal defence that might otherwise have contained the threat within a decade or two of its beginning. A fragmentation the raiders exploited with a consistency that stopped well before this story's end, looking like coincidence and started looking like the single most reliable predictor of Viking success anywhere this story travelled, and they were feared. Fourth and finally, because the fear itself became over time a genuinely effective weapon in its own right. A reputation for ruthless, well-publicised violence that could extract an enormous ransom, as it did at Paris in 845, or secure a permanent grant of land, as it did for Rollo in Normandy in 911, without the raiders needing to fight a single additional battle at all, since a reputation terrifying enough could simply be cashed in again and again for exactly the wealth or the territory that a harder-fought campaign might otherwise have been required to win by force. But it is worth ending this particular accounting, as this whole story has tried to end nearly every one of its individual threads tonight by insisting one final time that fear was never the whole of what these people were, or the whole of what they built. The same restless energy that burned Lindisfarne also settled Iceland and raised, at Thingvellir, one of the oldest continuously functioning representative assemblies the world has ever known. The same shipbuilding mastery that carried raiders up the Seine also carried explorers to a second continent 5 centuries ahead of anyone else in Europe. The same warrior culture that filled a church's daily prayers with dread also produced a poetic tradition of genuine and lasting sophistication, and a body of law and a body of art, and, in the children and grandchildren of the raiders themselves, kings who built cathedrals, endowed monasteries, and stood, however briefly and however performatively, on an English beach commanding a tide they knew perfectly well would not obey them, in open acknowledgement that no earthly power, however vast, however feared, however hard won, was ever going to last forever. A story balanced on small hinges. Before we walk back through the whole of this long night story one final time, it is worth pausing to sit, honestly, with how much of what you have just heard turned on moments that could very easily have gone another way, because it is tempting, looking backward across 3 centuries of dramatic and consequential events, to imagine the whole story as inevitable, one grand movement rolling forward under its own unstoppable momentum, and that temptation, however comforting a tidy narrative it offers, is not what the actual evidence supports. Consider how differently this story might read if the political disunity we have named, again and again tonight, as one of the single most reliable predictors of Viking success, had simply not existed at any of its crucial moments. If Charlemagne's empire had passed intact to a single strong successor, rather than fracturing, at the Treaty of Verdun, into 3 mutually suspicious and periodically warring kingdoms, at the precise moment its coast most needed unified defence, the raiding fleets that ascended the Seine and the Loire across the 9th century might have found the same kind of organised, well-funded coastal defence that Alfred eventually built in Wessex. And a great deal of this story's Frankish chapters might simply never have happened at all, or happened on a far smaller and far less consequential scale. Consider, too, how differently the story of England alone might have unfolded if a single winter surprise attack in January of 1878 had gone only slightly differently. If Guthrum's forces had captured or killed Alfred himself during those desperate weeks in the Somerset marshes, rather than merely driving him into hiding, since there was, at that specific and genuinely precarious moment in this whole story, no obvious second candidate waiting in the wings to rally Wessex the way Alfred himself eventually did. No guarantee whatsoever that the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom would have found another leader capable of the counterattack at Edington that saved it. which means that the entire subsequent history of an English-speaking, rather than a fully Scandinavian-ruled England, the England that would eventually produce Shakespeare and the common law, and, in time, an empire that spread the English language to every continent on Earth, may have hinged in some very real sense on a single group of exhausted, half-starving fugitives evading capture in a Somerset marsh for a few crucial weeks in the early months of 878. Consider as well that single autumn of 1066, perhaps the single most concentrated cluster of contingency in this entire story, because had Harold Hardrada's Norwegian invasion landed even a few weeks later, or had Duke William's Norman fleet delayed for weeks that summer and autumn by contrary winds, that a slightly different pattern of channel weather could easily have shortened or lengthened, crossed the channel before rather than after Stamford Bridge. Harold Godwinson's exhausted army might never have been forced into the brutal double-forced march that left it, by the 14th of October, too depleted to hold its shield wall through a full day's fighting at Hastings, and an English-ruled rather than a Norman-ruled, England might have continued indefinitely down an entirely different linguistic and political path, one in which the thousands of French words that flooded into English in the wake of the Norman conquest, an inheritance so deep that a large share of the English vocabulary you are hearing in this very sentence descends from it, might simply never have arrived at all. And consider, finally, on a far smaller and more personal scale, but no less real for it, the Norse settlement at Vinland, which came so close and yet never quite managed to becoming something considerably larger and more permanent than a single base camp on the tip of Newfoundland, undone, so far as the fragmentary evidence allows us to judge, not by any lack of Norse seamanship or Norse courage, but by simple, brutal demographic arithmetic. A small and unreinforceable colony, thousands of miles from any hope of resupply, facing an indigenous population that could draw on numbers the Greenland settlements never could. And it is worth wondering quietly in the dark what the history of the following 1,000 years might have looked like had that arithmetic worked out even slightly differently, had a slightly larger wave of Greenlandic settlers followed Leif Erikson west, had the conflict with the peoples the sagas call Skraelings gone even slightly better for the newcomers. A whole alternate 5 centuries of contact, exchange, and quite possibly renewed and even more devastating conflict between 2 very different worlds, arriving 500 years earlier than it actually did, and unfolding in ways this story, sitting on this side of the history that actually happened, has no way of confidently predicting at all. None of this is to say that nothing in this story mattered, or that skill and courage and hard-won technological mastery counted for nothing against sheer accident, because they plainly counted for a great deal. The longship itself, the product of centuries of patient, deliberate refinement rather than lucky accident, and Alfred's berth building and Knut's careful diplomacy, the product of real and considerable political skill rather than blind fortune. It is only to say what this channel has said before, across other long nights and other long stories, and will very likely say again, history is not a single locked-in destiny, unfolding according to some hidden inevitable logic, but an enormous accumulation of individually contingent decisions, weather patterns, chance encounters, and near misses, each one reasonable or understandable, or simply unavoidable in its own immediate moment, that only look, from the comfortable distance of 13 centuries, like the inevitable chapters of a story that could never have gone any other way. Let us walk back through it all. We began this long night on a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria, in the year 793, with a bishop named Higbald watching his monastery burn and a scholar named Alcuin, hearing the news from across the sea, reaching for words strong enough to describe a terror Christian Europe had never before had reason to imagine. We went back from there to the world that had produced the men in those dragon-headed ships, a Scandinavia of fjords and forests and thin, hard-won farmland, of chieftains whose authority rested on gifts and reputation rather than inherited law, of a religion that prized courage and a fame that outlived the body, and of a shipbuilding tradition, centuries in the patient making, that gave these scattered communities a mastery of the sea no other people in contemporary Europe could match. We watched that mastery meet a Christian Europe whose own wealth, concentrated in undefended monasteries and whose own political unity, fractured by civil war among Charlemagne's own grandsons, made it, in hindsight, almost perfectly designed to be exploited by exactly the kind of fast, unpredictable, opportunistic raiding this story has followed. We followed the tide up the rivers of Francia to Dorestad and to Paris and watched a single ransom payment in 845 teach an entire raiding world that Frankish silver could be extracted without a fight at all. We crossed to England and watched the great heathen army dismantle 3 of 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in barely a decade, and watched a single surviving kingdom, Wessex, and a single king, Alfred, driven into hiding in a Somerset marsh, claw its way back to a victory decisive enough to carve England for a generation into a Christian Wessex and a Scandinavian Danelaw, whose place names and whose words for sky and knife and law still surround English speakers today without their even notic. We crossed to Ireland and watched raiding camps called long forts grow, generation by generation, into Dublin and Waterford and Wexford and Cork and Limerick, and watched a supposedly clean contest between Irish king and Viking invader at Clontarf dissolve, on closer honest inspection, into the same blended, intermarried, endlessly complicated Norse-Irish world that this whole story kept insisting the evidence actually supported. We asked, honestly, what made all of this so uniquely terrifying, and found the answer in unpredictability, in violated sanctity, and in a calculated, publicised brutality that could extract a fortune through reputation alone. We turned east and followed an entirely different current of this same restless energy down the Volga and the Dnieper, traders more than raiders, founding Novgorod and Kiev, reaching Miklagard itself, and meeting, in the careful unsettled prose of an Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, both the physical splendour and the genuine, documented cruelty of a slave-trading river culture that this story refused to look away from. We turned west into open, empty Atlantic water, and followed Norse sailors to a treeless volcanic island where they built one of the oldest self-governing assemblies in recorded human history, and on to Greenland, and finally, 5 centuries ahead of Columbus, to the shores of North America itself, a landfall this story once treated as pure legend and that a spade in the Newfoundland turf in 1960 confirmed as solid, undeniable fact. We paused, in the middle of all of it, to hold both hands open at once, correcting the horned helmet that never existed, naming the genuine and documented legal standing of Norse women alongside the genuine limits of that standing, admiring the sophistication of the Althing and the skulls and the interlaced art of Oseberg's shipprow, and refusing in the very same breath to look away from an economy of enslaved human beings that ran underneath nearly everything else this story described. We named the dead this story could not name individually, the monks and villagers and enslaved captives who left behind no letters and no chronicles, and we heard, in Archbishop Wulfston's furious sermons to a kingdom tearing itself apart under renewed invasion, one of the very few surviving voices that lets us feel something of what it was actually like to live through this story from the inside rather than read about it from the safety of 13 centuries' distance. We asked, honestly, how we know any of this at all, and admitted that nearly every chronicle this story has quoted was written by the victim's own side, and that nearly every Norse saga was written centuries after the fact by Christian authors reshaping oral memory, and that it has fallen again and again to patient, ideologically indifferent archaeology to correct and complete a picture that, written sources alone could never have given us honestly. We untangled the legendary Ragnar from whatever real, nameless man or men actually led the raid on Paris and fathered the sons who conquered Northumbria, and we watched a chieftain named Rollo turn a permanent Viking occupation of the Seine into the founding grant of Normandy, and a Danish prince named Knut assemble 3 crowns and then, according to legend at least, publicly humble himself before a tide he knew he could not command. And we ended, at last, in that single extraordinary autumn of 1066, watching an English king, a Norwegian king descended from the oldest raiding tradition this story ever followed, and a Norman duke descended, 5 generations back, from a Viking chieftain of the Seine, fight over the very throne that a bishop named Higbald's monastery had once stood, undefended and unsuspecting, within reach of. We watched the tide, in its very last great surge, wash one final time over English soil, and then, in the centuries that followed Christian conversion, coastal fortification, and the slow, steady consolidation of the very kingdoms it had once found so easy to exploit, watched it recede, wave by wave, leaving behind not emptiness but an entire changed shoreline, cities, language, law, genes, and a reputation for terror that outlived by many centuries the actual raiding that first earned it. That brings us to the end of our story. I find myself thinking, as this long night draws to its own quiet close, about that single simple plea that entered the daily prayers of a frightened continent 13 centuries ago, from the fury of the Northmen, "Good Lord, deliver us." And about how strange it is that a fear once urgent enough to be spoken aloud in church after church, year after year, decade after decade, across an entire continent, could, in the end, simply fade. Not because any single battle finally settled the question once and for all, but because the world on both sides of that fear slowly, quietly changed. The raiders becoming farmers and kings and Christian converts, and the raided building walls and fleets and kingdoms strong enough that the old easy opportunities simply stopped presenting themselves. There is something worth carrying with you into your own sleep tonight in that slow fading, I think. A reminder that even the most consuming, most historically vivid terror a whole civilization can hold in its collective chest for 300 years does not, in the end, last forever. That fear, however real, however earned, however many prayers it once required, is very rarely the final word history actually has to say about anything. Think for a moment, as your own eyes grow heavier, about that tide we spent this whole night watching rise and recede, about a monk on a small island who could not have imagined, watching his church burn, that the very people burning it would one day settle Iceland's stony coast and raise an assembly that still meets today, or send explorers to a shore no other European would see again for 500 years, or father the very kings and dukes who would go on to shape the language you are hearing this story told in right now. History rarely announces, in the moment any of it is actually happening, which of its own particular terrors will fade into a line on a genetic ancestry report and a handful of place names on a map, and which of its ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdays will turn out, 1,000 years later, to have been the whole hinge the future was quietly turning on. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, whatever worry followed you into this bed and is still sitting somewhere at the edge of your thoughts even now, it too is smaller, I promise you, than the fear that once filled an entire continent's prayers, and if that fear could recede wave by wave, until it left behind nothing more frightening than a runestone in a quiet field and a ship in a quiet museum, then whatever is keeping you from sleep tonight can recede as well, in its own time, in its own way, leaving behind, when it finally does, a shoreline you may not even recognize as changed until you look back on it, calmly, from some much later and much more peaceful night than this one. Thank you so much for spending these long, quiet hours with me tonight, drifting through fjords and monasteries and river towns and burial mounds, through kings who prayed too long and princes who charged too soon, through a tide that rose across 3 centuries and just as patiently pulled back out to sea again. If this story kept you company through the dark, and if you would like more nights exactly like this one, consider subscribing and leaving this video running so that more of these long, slow histories can find their way to you while you sleep. And if you made it all the way here, awake enough still to hear these very last words, let me know down in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are, because I do love knowing how far this little corner of the internet quietly reaches while the rest of the world sleeps around you. Close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let the ships and the runestones and the long cold fjords drift slowly out of focus, the way a coastline drifts out of sight behind a ship's own wake. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight, nothing more you need to remember, nothing more this story needs from you at all except your own rest. Good night and sweet dreams.